Hey, welcome back, my friend, or maybe welcome for the very first time. Either way, I'm really glad you're here. Get comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull the blanket just a little closer, because tonight we're going back 316 years to one single night in January that changed an entire continent forever, and I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at a glass of wine the same way again. Imagine waking up one morning and your wine sitting on the table, right next to a burning fireplace is completely frozen solid. Not chilled, not cold, frozen. Now imagine that's not the strangest thing you see that morning, because outside your window, birds are falling from the sky, not dying on the way down, falling alive and hitting the ground frozen stiff before they can even flap their wings once. Ancient oak trees that had survived for 200 years are splitting open with a sound like a gunshot. Church bells are shattering the moment someone tries to ring them. And somewhere out there, an entire sea, the Baltic Sea, is frozen solid, not just along the shore, all the way across. People are walking from one country to another on foot, on the sea. This is January 1709, and this is the night Europe went completely, catastrophically silent. 600,000 people will die before this is over, and nobody saw it coming. All right, before we dive in, if you're enjoying the kind of stories I bring to this channel, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Not because some algorithm told me to ask you, but because when you do that, it genuinely helps more people find these stories that I think deserve to be heard. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are right now. Are you in bed? On the couch? Somewhere unexpected? I genuinely love reading those. Maybe even leave me a word or two about what drew you to this one tonight. And one more thing, dim the lights if you can. Maybe turn on a soft fan in the background. Let the room settle around you, because that's exactly the kind of mood this story deserves. All right, let's go. The date is January the 5th. 1709. It is a Tuesday evening, and across Europe, millions of ordinary people are doing exactly what you might be doing right now, winding down, finishing supper, tending to the fire, tucking children into bed. The winter of 1708 and 1709 had been cold. Sure, but winters are cold. Nobody was alarmed. In Paris, the streets were quiet. Along the Seine, a few fishermen were still out, their breath visible in the pale moonlight. In the grand palace of Versailles, just outside the city, candles glowed behind towering windows that were designed for show, not warmth. Servants moved quietly through marble hallways that, on a normal night, were already chilly enough to make you wish you'd worn an extra layer. In Venice, the famous canals still moved, dark and liquid, reflecting the lanterns along the fondamenta. In London, the Thames was partly frozen at the edges, but nothing unusual. Up in Sweden, King Charles XII was somewhere on a military campaign in the east, a man so obsessed with conquest he seemed to have forgotten that nature does not negotiate. And in a little English town called Upminster, a clergyman and amateur weather observer named William Derham had his thermometer outside, recording temperatures as he did every single night. Nothing about January the 5th seemed unusual, and then came the morning of January the 6th. No one can say exactly what hour it happened. There were no weather forecasts, no alerts, no notifications buzzing on anyone's phone, obviously. You simply went to sleep in one world and woke up in another, because overnight, temperatures across the entire European continent collapsed. Not gradually, not over several days, overnight, from England to Russia, from Scandinavia all the way down to the Mediterranean coast of France. In a matter of hours, a wall of Arctic air descended with a ferocity that stunned everyone who experienced it, and still puzzles climate scientists today. William Derham's thermometer plunged to negative 12 degrees Celsius, roughly 10 degrees Fahrenheit near London, and that was considered one of the milder recordings on the continent. In parts of France, temperatures crashed to negative 20 degrees Celsius. In some inland regions, even colder, But here is the thing about cold. You can describe a number, -20, -25, and the number feels abstract, doesn't it? So let me paint it differently. At -20 degrees Celsius, exposed skin begins to suffer frostbite in under 10 minutes. The moisture inside your nose freezes the moment you breathe in. If you pour water outside, it hits the ground already forming ice crystals. Metal door handles, tools, weapons become so cold it can tear the skin right off your palm if you grip it barehanded. That is what January the 7th, 1709 felt like in Paris. And it did not stop for 3 months. Now, I want you to picture the Duchess of Orleans. Her name is Elizabeth Charlotte. She is the sister-in-law of King Louis XIV, the most powerful man in Europe, living inside the most extravagant palace ever built. She has furs, she has roaring fires, she has servants whose entire job is to keep her comfortable. And on the morning of January the 10th, she sits down to write a letter to her aunt in Germany. She writes, "I am sitting by a roaring fire, have a screen before the door, which is closed, so that I can sit here with a sable fur piece around my neck and my feet in a bearskin sack. And I am still shivering with cold and can barely hold the pen. Never in my life have I seen a winter such as this one, which freezes the wine in bottles. She can barely hold the pen." This woman, in Versailles, wrapped in sable fur, feet in a bearskin sack, still shivering. Now ask yourself if she is barely surviving this. What is happening to the farmer in the field, the seamstress in her one-room cottage, the child sleeping on a straw mat with nothing but a thin wool blanket? That contrast, the most privileged woman in France, still shaking, that is what tells you just how extraordinary this winter truly was. And here is the detail that I personally cannot get out of my head. The wine freezes at approximately -4 to -5 degrees Celsius, much colder than water. Because of the alcohol content, for wine to freeze inside a bottle that is sitting next to a fireplace, the ambient temperature in the room must be so low that the fire's warmth cannot overcome it. Think about what that means. You are burning wood. You have a visible flame. You can feel the heat on your face when you lean forward, and yet, 12 inches to the side of that flame, the wine in the bottle is solid ice. The memoirist, the Duke of Saint-Simon, a man who lived at Versailles and wrote down everything he saw, noted with genuine bewilderment that wine bottles were bursting next to fireplaces. Not in the cellar, not outside, next to the fire. That is not a harsh winter. That is something else entirely. Across the continent, the signs were everywhere, and they were the kind of signs that felt almost supernatural to the people experiencing them. In Beaune, a city in the Burgundy wine region of France, a cathedral canon named Jean wrote in his journal, "Travellers died in the countryside, livestock in the stables, wild animals in the woods. Nearly all the birds died. Wine froze in barrels, and public fires were lit to warm the poor. Nearly all the birds died. Flocks of bird starlings, sparrows, finches were falling out of the sky mid-flight. Not shot, not sick, simply frozen while flying, their tiny bodies locking up in the air and dropping like stones to the ground below. Some witnesses described the sound of them hitting the cobblestones, a soft, terrible percussion across the city. Meanwhile, in Copenhagen harbour, the harbour master recorded 27 inches, that is nearly 70 centimetres of solid ice covering the port. Ships locked in place, trade paralysed, sailors trapped aboard vessels with dwindling provisions, unable to move. The Baltic Sea, one of the largest bodies of salt water in the northern hemisphere, froze completely solid. Not just the surface, solid enough to carry wagons. Heavily loaded supply wagons were crossing from Denmark to Sweden across open sea. People on foot, on horseback, travelling routes that in any other year would have been deep water beneath them. Even the hot springs of Aachen in what is now Germany, springs so warm they'd been famous since the days of the Roman Empire, froze over completely. If you know anything about hot springs, you know how stunning that is. These are waters heated from deep underground. And they froze in Venice, which sits in the middle of a lagoon. Surrounded by salt water, the canals turned to ice. The famous gondolas were locked in place, and Venetians, ever adaptable, took to wearing ice skates and gliding through the streets of their city like something from a dream. There is something almost beautiful about that image, isn't there? Venice on ice. If you put it in a painting, it would look like a fantasy, but the beauty lasted about a week. After that, the cold was just killing things. And here is where the story becomes something that no painting can fully capture, because the cold of 1709 was not a single event. It was a sustained siege. Modern climatologists, studying the historical records centuries later, have identified 6 distinct waves of sub-zero temperatures between January and mid-March. The first wave, the one that hit overnight on January the 5th into the 6th, was the most dramatic, the most sudden, but every time people dared to hope the worst was over, another wave came. A brief thaw arrived around January the 24th. People stepped outside, breathed in air that didn't hurt, and felt something very close to relief. And then it came back. Harder. February brought another freeze. Then March. The ground, by this point, was locked solid to a depth of over 1 meter, more than 3 feet, making it nearly impossible to even dig graves for the people who were dying. Think about that for a moment. You lose someone you love, and you cannot bury them. You carry that weight while also fighting for your own survival in the cold. In total, Europe would not fully thaw until April. 90 days of frost. 90 days of birds falling from the sky. Wine turning to ice. And an entire civilization slowly grinding to its knees. 600,000 people. That is the number historians estimate died in France alone, not counting the rest of Europe before the winter and its aftermath were finished. To put that in modern perspective, that is roughly the population of the city of Baltimore. Maryland, gone in one season, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, on this first morning, January the 6th, 1709, nobody knows any of that yet. Right now, people are just cold and confused and looking at their frozen wine bottles with expressions that history, fortunately, managed to record. William Derham, that quiet clergyman in Upminster with his thermometer and his careful handwriting, would later send his observations to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific body in the world at that time. And he wrote something that manages to be both matter-of-fact and breathtaking at the same time. He wrote, "I believe the frost was greater, if not more universal, also than any other within the memory of man." Within the memory of man, he was right. It was the coldest winter Europe had experienced in 500 years. And the question that kept scientists awake then and still keeps climate researchers awake today is simply, why? But before we get to the science, and trust me, the science behind this is as strange and unsettling as anything you'll hear tonight, there is something you need to understand first. Because 1709 didn't become the deadliest winter in European history just because it was cold. It became deadly because of everything that was already broken before the cold arrived. Europe in 1709 was a continent already bleeding from wars, from poverty, from a harvest that had partially failed the year before. The winter didn't fall on a healthy world. It fell on a world that was already on its knees. And that story, the story of why Europe was so fragile, so perfectly positioned to be shattered, is exactly what we need to explore next. Because understanding that is the only way to understand how 600,000 people died and how close the rest of Europe came to following them. So here is something I want you to think about for a second. Imagine you are handed a glass beautiful crystal filled with the best wine money can buy, and you drop it. It shatters on the floor. Now, you could blame the fall, the moment it left your hand, the trajectory, the impact. But if that glass had already been cracked before you picked it up, if there were hairline fractures running through the crystal that nobody noticed, then the fall was not really the cause of the shatter, was it? The fall was just the last thing, the thing that finished what had already been broken. That is exactly what happened to Europe in 1709. The winter was not the cause of the catastrophe. It was the final crack, and to understand why 600,000 people died, why it was that many, and not, say, 60,000, you have to go back further, much further, to a Europe that had been silently fracturing for decades before the first flake of snow ever fell. Let's start with France, because France is where the story hurts most. In the year 1709, France was, on paper, the most powerful nation on earth. Louis XIV had been on the throne for over 60 years, one of the longest reigns in European history. He had built Versailles, arguably the most magnificent building ever constructed. He commanded the largest army on the continent. He was called the Sun King, and the nickname was not ironic. The entire European court system revolved around him like planets around a star. But underneath all that gold and marble and carefully choreographed grandeur, France was quietly hemorrhaging, and most of it came down to one thing, specifically, the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, I know the name sounds like the kind of thing your history teacher droned on about while you stared out the window, and honestly, I get it. Succession crisis doesn't exactly make your pulse race, sir, but stay with me, because what this war did to France is genuinely astonishing. It started in the year 1701. A Spanish king died without an heir, as Spanish kings love to do. Apparently and suddenly, every major power in Europe was scrambling to put their guy on the Spanish throne. Louis XIV had his grandson in mind. Britain, the Dutch Republic, Austria, they had very different ideas. And so a war began that would drag on for 13 years and drain France of something it could not afford to lose: its people, its money, and its food. By the time January 1709 arrived, France had been at war for 8 consecutive years. 8 years of feeding armies, paying soldiers, buying weapons, and losing sons in fields from Flanders to Bavaria. At the Battle of Malplaquet in September 1709, just months after the freeze, France would suffer 12,000 casualties in a single afternoon. 12,000 in one battle, in one day. But the human cost of the war was not just the soldiers who died fighting. It was the young men conscripted from farms, leaving behind wives and elderly parents to tend the land with fewer hands. It was the taxes relentless, compounding taxes that fell heaviest on the people least able to pay them: the peasants, the tenant farmers, the artisans in the provincial towns. Here is a number that puts it in perspective. A typical French peasant family in the early 18th century spent somewhere between 50 and 60% of their total income on bread alone. Not food. Bread. Just bread. Under normal circumstances, that left almost nothing for everything else: clothing, tools, fuel, rent. Any disruption to the bread supply didn't create discomfort. It created immediate crisis, and the bread supply had already been disrupted. The year 1708 had not been a good year for harvests in France. The historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, one of the greatest scholars of French climatic and social history, documented carefully how late frosts and prolonged autumn rains in 1708 had already made the year's cereal harvest mediocre. Wheat, rye, winter oats, all of them came in below what was needed. Grain reserves heading into the winter of 1708 and 1709 were thin, not dangerously thin yet, but thin enough that any shock to the system would hurt badly. And then January the 5th arrived. Think about what that timing means. The people of France weren't walking into the worst winter in 500 years from a position of comfort and surplus. They were walking into it already half empty, already taxed to exhaustion, already with fewer farm workers because so many young men had been conscripted into the army, already paying inflated prices for grain that hadn't fully recovered from the previous year's shortfall. The frost didn't find a healthy society and destroy it. It found a society that was already wounded and finished the job. And here is the part that I find genuinely haunting. The people who were making the decisions had no idea this was coming, not because they were stupid, but because in 1709 there was no such thing as a weather forecast. You couldn't watch a meteorologist point at a swirling red mass on a satellite map and say, "Folks, batten down the hatches. This one's going to be historic." You had no satellite. You had no instruments good enough to detect what was building in the atmosphere. You had your experience of past winters, and your experience said that winters come and winters go. Sometimes they're bad, but they pass. They always pass. And this brings me to something that I think about a lot, not just in the context of 1709, but in the context of how human societies tend to fail in general. There is a pattern. It shows up again and again in history, and it is almost painfully predictable once you see it. A society accumulates stress over time. Wars, debts, crop failures, inequality, each one a small weight added to the scale. And because each individual weight is manageable, nobody sounds the alarm. The scale is heavy, yes, but it's holding, and then something unexpected arrives: a drought, a disease, a winter. And it doesn't have to be catastrophic on its own to become catastrophic in context. It just has to be the weight that tips the balance. Historians call this a compound crisis, a cascade, and 1709 is one of the most perfect, if that word is appropriate, examples in recorded history. War debt had pushed France to the edge of financial collapse. Grain reserves were already low from 1708's poor harvests. The rural poor were already malnourished and physically weakened. The young men who should have been working the land were in uniform, somewhere in Flanders, loading muskets in the cold. And into all of that, the worst winter in half a millennium. You want to know why 600,000 people died? That's why. Not just the cold and the war and the taxes and the thin harvest and the missing farm workers and the inflated bread prices and the government that was simultaneously fighting a war and trying to manage a famine and had no idea that the freeze was coming until it was already here. Remove any one of those factors and the death toll looks very different. Keep all of them and you get 1,709. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. Because France was not alone in this vulnerability. The same pattern was playing out across the entire continent, just with different local details. In England, which was also deeply involved in the War of the Spanish Succession, the economic pressures were real but somewhat cushioned by greater naval wealth and trade income. England's per capita gross domestic product would still fall by roughly 23% in 1709. A collapse comparable in scale to the early years of the Great Depression. But England had better grain reserves, fewer conscripted farmers, and slightly less institutional chaos than France. So England survived the winter badly wounded rather than catastrophically broken. In Sweden, the situation was almost the mirror image in a different direction. King Charles XII, and we will come back to him in detail, because his story is one of the most dramatic in this entire saga, had marched his army into Russia in 1708. Confident, aggressive, seemingly invincible, Sweden was a military superpower at this moment, punching far above its population weight, but military superpowers still need to eat. And Swedish soldiers, deep in Ukrainian winter, discovered something very old and very brutal. No amount of military genius defeats starvation. When the Great Frost arrived, it hit Swedish soldiers just as hard as it hit French peasants, just in a different field, with different consequences. And in Germany, the German Palatine region specifically, along the Rhine River Valley, the combination of war devastation, economic collapse, and the brutality of 1709 would trigger one of the great human migrations of the early 18th century. Over 13,000 German Palatine refugees would eventually make their way to England, and then onward to the American colonies, fleeing a homeland that simply could not sustain them anymore. Some of your ancestors, if you have German roots in Pennsylvania or the Carolinas, may well trace their American story directly back to the winter of 1709. Isn't that something? A disaster so total that it reshuffled the population of a continent. But I want to come back to France one more time, because there is one detail about the pre-freeze situation that I think deserves its own moment. The Marquis de Vauban, one of the most brilliant military engineers in French history, The man who designed France's entire system of border fortifications had sat down in 1707 and written a book, a remarkable, almost radical book for its time, called La Dîme Royale, which translates roughly as the royal tithe. In it, he surveyed the economic condition of France with meticulous honesty, and what he found was not the glittering superpower that Louis XIV's propaganda projected. What he found was a country where roughly 1/10 of the population was reduced to begging, another third was barely surviving on debt and charity, and only a tiny minority was genuinely comfortable. He proposed a revolutionary idea, a universal income tax of 3 to 5% on everyone, including the nobility, to ease the burden on the peasants and stabilize the kingdom's finances. Louis XIV banned the book immediately. Think about what that tells you. Here was arguably the smartest man in France, the person who built the fortifications that kept France safe, telling the king, "Your country's more fragile than you know." And the king's response was essentially, "I don't want to hear it." 2 years later, 600,000 people were dead. I'm not saying one decision caused the other. History is never that clean. But there is something deeply sobering about reading that sequence of events. The warning was there, the vulnerability was visible, if you were willing to look, and the refusal to look, the insistence on projecting strength instead of honestly assessing fragility, meant that when the winter arrived, France had no buffer left, no margin for error, no room for the worst winter in 500 years. And this, I think, is the lesson that Part 2 carries, the one that outlasts the history lesson, and follows you into your ordinary life. Because here's the thing, we all know, intellectually, that bad things happened, unexpected things, things that no one predicts and no one prepares for. We know that, and yet we have this very human tendency to believe that our current state of stability is permanent, that the glass isn't cracked, that the system is fine, that we have enough margin to absorb whatever comes. Sometimes we're right, and sometimes January the 5th arrives overnight. The people of France in 1708 weren't reckless or foolish. They were doing what humans do, managing the pressures in front of them, adapting to the stresses they could see, trusting that the structure would hold, and the structure held right up until it didn't. What makes 1709 so extraordinary is not just the scale of what happened, it's the speed. One night, one temperature drop, and an entire civilization that had been running on empty for years simply had nothing left to give. So now we know the world that January the 6th walked into, a Europe already on its knees, already cracked, already thin at the margins, a France carrying the weight of 8 years of war on the backs of farmers who were already one bad harvest away from catastrophe. We know the stage. Now what exactly was the science behind the curtain? What force of nature was powerful enough to freeze the Baltic Sea, shatter church bells, drop the temperature of an entire continent in a single night, and then stay, stubbornly, relentlessly, for 3 more months? The answer involves a dying sun, a chain of volcanoes, and a meteorological mystery that the world's best climate scientists still cannot fully explain. And that story is the one we are stepping into next. Right? So a dying sun, a chain of volcanoes, and a mystery that still keeps scientists up at night. Let's talk about the sun first, because the story of 1709 actually begins not on Earth, but roughly 93 million miles away from it. Between the years 1645 and 1715, a stretch of 70 years, astronomers across Europe noticed something deeply strange happening to the sun, something no one had ever seen before, and something that, if you told a person today, they would probably find quietly terrifying. The sunspots disappeared. Now, let me explain why that matters. The sun, in normal times, is a restless, turbulent ball of magnetic activity. Its surface is constantly churning with storms of incredible scale, and one of the visible signs of all that magnetic energy is sunspots, dark, cooler patches on the surface that appear and fade in a roughly 11-year cycle. In any given modern 30-year period, Astronomers typically count between 40,000 and 50,000 sunspots. Between 1672 and 1699, 28 years, smack in the middle of this strange era, careful. Systematic observers across Europe counted fewer than 50 sunspots total. 50 in 28 years. That is not a quiet period. That is a sun that has, in some deeply unsettling way, gone nearly silent. Astronomers eventually named this the Maunder minimum, after the English solar astronomer Edward Walter Maunder and his wife Annie Russell Maunder, who actually did much of the foundational research, but whose name, because she hadn't been permitted to earn a university degree, was left off the papers for decades, which is its own quietly infuriating footnote to history. The year 1709 fell right at the tail end of this Maunder minimum. The sun, for 70 years, had been outputting less energy, less ultraviolet radiation, less of the warmth that drives the climate systems of an entire planet. And here is where it gets interesting and honestly a little humbling, if you are someone who likes clean answers, because the Maunder minimum, while real and well documented, does not fully explain 1709 on its own. The sun was quieter, yes, but a quieter sun explains a general backdrop of cooler temperatures across Europe, the broader context of what historians call the Little Ice Age, that long cold chapter that ran roughly from the 1300s to the mid-1800s. What it does not explain is why January the 5th, 1709 specifically, saw temperatures plunge across an entire continent in a single night. The Maunder minimum had been running for 60 years at that point. Winters had been cold before, within it, but not like this. So what else was happening? Enter the volcanoes. And yes, there were several. When a large volcano erupts violently enough to blast material into the stratosphere, the upper layer of atmosphere, 15 to 30 miles above our heads, it can inject millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into a realm where the jet stream cannot simply wash it away. Up there, those sulfur particles combine with water vapor to form a thin veil of sulfuric acid droplets. And that veil does something remarkable and terrifying. It scatters incoming sunlight, reflecting it back into space before it can reach the Earth's surface. The result is called a volcanic winter, and history has several devastating examples. When the Indonesian volcano Tambora erupted in 1815, it triggered what became known as the Year Without a Summer 1816, when snow fell in New England in June, crops failed across the northern hemisphere, and famine swept from Europe to China. One eruption, one veil of ash and sulfur, 1 year of catastrophe. In the years leading up to 1709, several European volcanoes had been active. Mount Tide on the Canary Islands, Santorini in the Aegean, Mount Vesuvius in Italy erupted in 1707 and again in 1708, just 1 and 2 years before the Great Frost. Each eruption added particles to the atmosphere. Each one contributed, in some small way, to a sky that was slightly less clear, a sun that delivered slightly less warmth. Now, and this is the honest part, climate scientists examining ice cores from Greenland have found that none of these eruptions produced the massive stratospheric sulfate spike that would indicate a truly catastrophic, climate-altering eruption on the scale of Tambora. The volcanic contribution to 1709 was likely real, but it was, in the technical language of the scientists, supplementary at best, a contributing factor, not a primary cause, which brings us back to the mystery. You might be wondering, at this point, whether I am going to give you a clean answer. The sun was dimmer, the volcanoes added dust, and together they created the worst winter in 500 years. Case closed. If only, here is the statement that I find genuinely extraordinary, and that I think deserves to sit in the room for a moment. In the early 2000s, the European Union funded a major research program called the Millennium Project, specifically tasked with studying historical climate patterns and understanding extreme weather events of the past. Among the events they examined was the Great Frost of 1709, and after all their analysis, One of the participating climatologists, Dennis Wheeler of the University of Sunderland in England, offered this assessment. He said, simply, something unusual seems to have been happening. Something unusual seems to have been happening. That is a scientist, funded by the European Union, with access to 300 years of accumulated data, looking at January 1709 and essentially saying, we know the usual suspects. We have examined all the evidence, and we still cannot fully explain this. That sentence, to me, is one of the most honest and quietly remarkable things a scientist can say, and it tells you something important. The winter of 1709 was not just historically extreme, it was and remains scientifically anomalous. An outlier so far outside normal parameters that even modern climate modelling, which can simulate centuries of weather patterns, consistently underestimates how cold it was by somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius. 2 to 4 degrees might not sound like much, but in climate terms, it is enormous. It is the difference between a hard winter and a killing winter. So if the sun and the volcanoes don't fully explain it, what does current thinking suggest? The best modern hypothesis, drawing on the atmospheric science of our own era, points towards something that people in 1709 had absolutely no framework to understand: a catastrophic disruption of the polar vortex. Think of the polar vortex as a massive, rapidly spinning ring of wind that circles the North Pole high in the stratosphere 20 to 30 miles above the surface. In a healthy winter, that ring spins tight and strong, like a well-balanced top, and its job is essentially to act as a lid. It keeps the coldest Arctic air locked up over the pole, contained where it belongs, down at the surface. The jet stream, the river of wind that shapes our weather, runs in a relatively steady west to east pattern. Cold in the north stays north. Manageable winters stay manageable. But occasionally, and this is where things become genuinely frightening, an atmospheric wave from the lower atmosphere slams into the stratosphere with enough force to buckle that spinning ring. Temperatures high above the Arctic can shoot upward by 30 or 40 degrees Celsius in just a matter of days. Not warm by any human standard, still far below freezing up there, but radically, suddenly warmer than they were, and when that happens, the polar vortex weakens, wobbles, and sometimes shatters. The lid comes off, and all of that Arctic air that was supposed to stay contained over the pole comes flooding southward. Meteorologists have a name for this: a sudden stratospheric warming, and when it happens in a severe enough form, the Arctic doesn't just send a little cold air south, it essentially moves itself south. The cold pours across continents in what scientists describe as a slow, looping exhalation. For days, for weeks, for months, if the vortex remains disrupted. Now here is the connection to 1709. And it is important to be honest about what we know and what we don't. Modern climate science cannot reach back 300 years and directly measure what the stratospheric polar vortex was doing on January the 5th. 1709. The instruments didn't exist. The data doesn't exist. What researchers can do is model the atmospheric conditions consistent with what the historical record shows the speed of the temperature drop, the geographic scale of the freeze, the way it started suddenly and then persisted in waves for months, and compare those patterns to what we now know about polar vortex disruptions. And what they find is that the pattern of 1709 is far more consistent with a massive polar vortex collapse than with any gradual cooling caused by reduced solar activity or volcanic dust. The speed of the January 5th drop, the continental scale, the persistence through multiple waves of refreezing, all of it looks, to modern eyes, like the signature of an Arctic lid that didn't just wobble, it shattered. But here's the part that I personally cannot stop thinking about. If the polar vortex theory is correct, it means that the great mystery of 1709 was not something that built slowly over years or decades. The Maunder minimum set the background. The volcanoes added a layer of atmospheric dust. But the actual trigger, the thing that sent temperatures plunging across an entire continent in a single night, may have been an atmospheric event that unfolded in days. Days. The background conditions created a landscape that was vulnerable. And then, somewhere high above the Arctic, a wave of atmospheric energy struck the spinning ring of polar wind at just the right angle, with just the right force, and the lid broke, and 36 to 48 hours later, wine was freezing next to fireplaces in Versailles. There is something almost poetic about that, even though poetic is not quite the right word when you're talking about 600,000 deaths. But think about it. 3 forces, a quieter sun, a handful of distant volcanic eruptions, and an atmospheric collapse that probably took less time to unfold than it takes to plan a dinner party combined to produce the worst climate disaster Europe had seen in 5 centuries, and nobody knew it was coming. I want to bring this to one more place before we move forward, because I think it would be a mistake to leave the science here without connecting it to something larger. We live in an era when we can forecast the weather a week in advance with reasonable accuracy. We have satellites watching the stratosphere around the clock. When the polar vortex wobbles today, meteorologists can see it wobbling days before the cold arrives at the surface. Cities can pre-position resources, governments can issue warnings, people can stock up on groceries and check on their elderly neighbours. None of that existed in 1709, and the difference between a world that can see the wave coming and prepare, and a world that wakes up one morning to discover the continent has frozen overnight is not just technological. It is fundamentally a difference in how many people survive. In February of 2021, when a severe polar vortex disruption sent Arctic air plunging into Texas, roughly 250 people lost their lives. It was a tragedy, but Texas in 2021, with all its failures and inadequacies in that crisis, still had heating systems, emergency services, food distribution networks, and the ability to call for help. France in January of 1709 had none of those things. No forecast, no warning, no buffer, and 600,000 people paid for that absence. Now the science of why it happened is, as you have just seen, genuinely complex and still not entirely resolved. 316 years later, we are still piecing together the full picture, and I find that honesty, that lingering uncertainty, somehow more chilling than a clean answer would be. But we have spent enough time in the stratosphere. It is time to come back down to Earth. Because knowing why the winter happened is one thing, what it actually felt like, day by day, city by city, person by person, the birds falling from the sky, the church bells shattering, the wine turning to ice right there next to the flame that is its own kind of story entirely. And it is the one we are stepping into next. Pull your blanket a little tighter, because what we are about to do is take a slow walk across an entire frozen continent city by city, river by river, and I want you to feel every single mile of it. We have talked about the night it happened. We have talked about why Europe was already cracked before the cold arrived. We have chased the science up into the stratosphere and back down again. But there is something that all of that context, necessary as it is, cannot quite give you, and that is the texture of the thing, the daily, hourly, almost unbearable specificity of what it actually looked and felt like when an entire continent froze. So let's go there. Let's walk through it together. Start in the north, because the north was where the cold settled first and most completely. The Baltic Sea, picture it for a moment, a body of water roughly the size of California, hemmed in by Sweden to the west, Finland and Russia to the northeast, Germany and Poland and the Baltic states to the south. It is salt water, which means it requires a lower temperature to freeze than a freshwater lake. Under normal circumstances, even in a cold winter, the Baltic might ice over partially along its northern edges, near the Finnish coastline, but it does not freeze as a whole. It cannot. It is too large, too salty, too constantly moved by the winds that sweep in from the North Sea. In January of 1709, it froze entirely, not just along the edges, all the way across, and it stayed frozen for 4 months. Let that land for a second. An inland sea, frozen solid, For a third of a year, by February, the ice was thick enough, and this is documented in multiple sources of the period, that people were crossing it on foot, on horseback, and in loaded wagons. Merchants who had no other way to move goods between Denmark and Sweden were driving horse-drawn carts across open sea. Not a frozen lake, not a river, the sea. Now, if you've ever walked out onto even a modest frozen pond and felt that slightly irrational vertigo of knowing there is water beneath you, the way your brain whispers, quietly and insistently, "This is not right," try to imagine that feeling multiplied across a landscape that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The sea, as far as you can see in any direction, solid and white, and you and your horse and your cart, creaking across it. Some of those crossings made it, some did not. Copenhagen Harbour, which is in Denmark, just in case geography was not your strongest subject in school, reported 27 inches of solid ice covering the port. Not a skim of frost. 27 inches. That is more than 2 feet of ice. Ships that had been in port when the freeze hit were simply locked in place, encased, unable to move. Their crews were trapped aboard them, and as the weeks passed and supplies dwindled, those crews began to perish not from any dramatic maritime disaster, but from the grinding accumulation of cold and hunger, and the slow failure of the body to sustain itself in conditions it was never designed to endure. There is something about that image, sailors dying on locked ships in a frozen harbour, unable to go anywhere, unable to do anything, simply waiting, that I find particularly haunting. These were people whose entire professional lives were defined by movement, by the sea as a thing that carries you, and the sea had become a prison. Moving south and west, the scale of the freezing becomes almost absurd in its thoroughness. Amsterdam, one of the great trading cities of the world, built on and around canals, dependent on water as its circulatory system went silent. The canals froze, the port froze, the ships that brought grain and timber and cloth and spices from across the world simply stopped arriving, because the waterways that connected Amsterdam to the sea were solid ice. The city that had, within living memory, been the commercial capital of Europe found itself cut off, its lifeblood literally frozen in place. The Rhine River froze, the Rhone in France froze, and the ice along the Rhone and Garonne rivers was documented as being thick enough to support the weight of laden carts, which climatologists have since calculated places the ice at roughly 11 inches deep. In the port of Marseille, on the Mediterranean coast of France, a city where winters are mild and snowfall is rare, ice appeared in the harbour, saltwater ice, in the Mediterranean. If you're sitting somewhere in California right now and you heard that Los Angeles Harbour had developed a coating of ice, you would think the news anchor had lost their mind. That is roughly the equivalent of what happened in Marseille in January 1709. The Seine in Paris froze so completely and so quickly, according to the memoirist, the Duke of Saint-Simon, within just 4 days of the temperature drop, that Parisians improvised a kind of frozen marketplace on its surface. Market stalls were set up on the ice. Ox carts loaded with goods trundled across it. People who had never walked on the river in their lives were suddenly doing their shopping on it. And then the supplies stopped coming, because the roads had also stopped working. Snow packed the roads of France to impassability, and Paris, a city of somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people, found itself completely cut off from the outside world. For 3 months, think about what that means for a city that size. No fresh supplies coming in, no grain convoys, no livestock being driven in from the surrounding countryside. Whatever was already inside the city walls was all there was, and it was not enough. Let me take you further south, because this is where the story becomes almost surreal. Valencia, Spain, sun-drenched, Mediterranean, famous for its orange groves and its warmth. A city that even in the depths of winter rarely sees temperatures drop below freezing. In January 1709, the cold reached Valencia and destroyed its olive trees. Not damaged, destroyed. Entire ancient groves, some of them centuries old, killed outright because the frost penetrated the soil deeply enough to freeze and rupture their root systems. Olive trees can survive a cold night. They cannot survive weeks of sustained sub-zero temperatures. The Ebro River in northeastern Spain, a significant river in its own right. Not a minor stream froze over completely. Rome and Florence, in Italy, were buried under snowfall heavy enough to completely cut them off from their surrounding regions. The city of Rome, which the ancient Romans had chosen partly because of its temperate climate, which had been a centre of Mediterranean culture for nearly 2,000 years, was inaccessible. No one could get in, no one could get out. Just snow, silence, and the particular desperation of a city that had run out of options. And then Portugal, even that western Atlantic edge of Europe, warmed by the Gulf Stream and accustomed to some of the mildest winters on the continent. Rivers froze in Portugal. And here is the detail that, to me, somehow captures the true absurdity of the entire event more vividly than anything else. Palm trees sank under the weight of the snow. Palm trees, covered in snow. There is no image in all of 1709 that quite says this should not be happening as clearly and as simply as a Portuguese palm tree buried in snow. That's the moment I wish I could show you a photograph of. That's the picture that lives in my head. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where something impossible was simply happening, and your brain could not quite process it because it had no category for that experience? That is what January 1709 was for every person living through it. The collective bafflement of a continent, not panic. At first, panic requires understanding that something is wrong. This was something stranger than panic. It was a kind of confused, stunned adjustment to a reality that made no sense. In the Adriatic Sea, the arm of the Mediterranean between Italy and the Balkans, dozens of ships were caught by the freeze and locked in the ice. Their crews, like the sailors in Copenhagen, were trapped. But the Adriatic is even less accustomed to freezing than the Baltic. Nobody who sailed those waters had ever seen this. Nobody who built those ships had designed them to sit in ice. And the crews, many of whom had been at sea in the relative warmth of a Mediterranean voyage just weeks before, were wholly unprepared for what had found them. Meanwhile, in Venice. And this is the one moment in this entire story where I will admit there is something almost beautiful mixed in with the horror. The frozen lagoon became something unexpected. In the first days, before the full weight of what was happening had settled on people, Venetians responded the way Venetians tend to respond to things, with a kind of theatrical, resigned creativity. They dug out ice skates. They skated through the streets of their city. They glided where gondolas had always floated. Children slid down frozen canal banks. There were, briefly, by some accounts, festivities on the ice, and then the food started running low, and the festivities stopped. What the cold did to living things beyond humans is its own chapter of this story, and I think it deserves a moment too, because it is not just a backdrop detail. It was, in many ways, the mechanism that turned a brutal winter into a famine. The fruit trees died first, not just the leaves or the fruit, but the trees themselves, root and branch, olive groves that had been producing oil for generations, gone. Vineyards that families had tended for a century, gone. The sap inside the tree trunks froze. When a liquid inside a container freezes, it expands, and when the sap of a tree expands with enough force, the tree does not just freeze, it explodes. Witnesses described hearing the oak forest crack like musket fire in the night. Tree after ancient tree splitting open with a sound like a gunshot as the frozen sap burst through the bark. That sound. Imagine trying to sleep through that. Every winter, wheat crop in the ground was destroyed. The frost went deep in some places. The soil was frozen to a depth of more than 1 meter. The seedlings were dead before they had a chance to grow. What that meant, practically, was that the spring harvest that France and the rest of Europe depended on to bridge the gap between the old grain stores and the new season that harvest did not exist. The cycle of food production which had been operating continuously for thousands of years, had been interrupted at its most fundamental level. The ground itself had been made hostile to life. The animals fared no better. Livestock froze to death in barns and stables, not from lack of shelter, but because the cold was so penetrating that shelter became insufficient. Fish were found dead beneath the ice of frozen rivers, suffocated as the oxygen depleted beneath the sealed surface. Deer lay dead in meadows. Hares and rabbits, which normally survive harsh winters through instinct and burrow, perished in enormous numbers. And then the wolves came. This is the part that, whenever I come back to it in the historical record, makes the back of my neck go cold in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. As wild prey disappeared as the deer died, as the rabbits vanished, as the small animals that wolves normally hunt froze or starved. The wolves of Central Europe lost all inhibition. They came into villages, not occasionally, not in isolated incidents, systematically, in packs. They attacked livestock, first cattle, pigs, whatever could be found, and when the livestock were gone, the wolves ate whatever else was available. And what was available, in January of 1709, in villages across France, Switzerland, and Germany, were human bodies, people who had died of cold in the fields, their bodies preserved by the very frost that had killed them. And as the weeks passed and the cold did not relent, the wolves grew bolder. The Princess Palatine, writing her letters from Versailles in February 1709, recorded that travellers on the roads were being attacked and consumed by wolves, not threatened. Consumed. There were no fences strong enough, no barriers effective enough. A wolf that has learned there is no danger in approaching a human will keep approaching humans. I want to be careful here, because I am not trying to be gratuitous, but I think this detail matters, because it tells you something true about what a total collapse of environmental order looks like, when the natural hierarchy of predator and prey breaks down, when a wolf that has spent its entire life avoiding human beings decides that the calculation has changed. You understand, viscerally, how complete the disruption of 1709 actually was. This was not a bad winter. This was a different world. The philosophers and priests of 1709 struggled to find a framework for what they were experiencing, which is entirely understandable when something falls outside the boundaries of all previous human experience. The mind reaches for the explanations it has, and in 1709, the dominant explanation offered in churches, in pamphlets, in the letters of educated people was a simple and ancient one. God's anger. The cold was a punishment. Europe had sinned. The suffering was divine correction. It is easy, from this distance, to smile at that explanation. We have satellite data and climate models. We know about polar vortices and the Maunder minimum. We can describe in technical language what happened in the stratosphere. But here is the thing I keep returning to. Those people were not stupid. They were using the best explanatory framework available to them, and the desire to find meaning in catastrophe, to believe that suffering has a reason, that it is not simply random, that the universe is ordered even when it feels terrifyingly chaotic, that impulse is deeply, essentially human. It has not gone away in 300 years. We just express it differently now. And there is something quietly poignant about the image of congregations across France in January of 1709, united in prayer that the winter would not last, people kneeling together in cold stone churches, breath visible in the icy air, asking something greater than themselves to please make it stop. It did eventually stop. Spring came. The cold released its grip in April, slowly and with one final cruel twist that we will come to shortly. But while it lasted those 90 days and their 6 waves of returning frost, it left marks on the continent that no prayer could undo. One last image, before we move into what came next. In the town of Beaune, in the Burgundy wine region of France, a place so synonymous with wine that even the name conjures something warm and rich and civilized, there was a canon of the cathedral who kept a record of what he saw. He wrote, Travellers died in the countryside, livestock in the stables, wild animals in the woods, nearly all the birds died, wine froze in barrels, and public fires were lit to warm the poor. That is the whole of 1709. In 5 sentences, the travellers, the livestock, the wild animals, the birds, the wine, and at the end of it, the only human response left: light a fire, stand around it, share what warmth remains. What that canon did not mention, because it was not yet visible in January of 1709, when the cold was still raging, was what came after. The cold released its hold. What happened when spring finally arrived and the ice began to melt? Because the thaw, it turned out, was not salvation. In some ways, it was the second wave of the catastrophe, and that is exactly where we are headed next. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being powerful. Most of us will never know it. When things fall apart in our lives, when a job is lost, or a relationship fractures, or something unexpected and terrible arrives without warning, we can reach out. We can call someone. We can sit with a friend and say, "This is happening to me, and I am frightened." We are allowed to be human in our fear. Louis XIV, in January of 1709, could not do that. He was 70 years old. He had reigned for 66 of those years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive. He was the Sun King, the absolute monarch, the living embodiment of France itself. He had built the most magnificent palace in the world as a declaration of personal invincibility. Everything about his life, the rituals, the ceremonies, the choreographed public appearances had been designed to project one single message: I am above this. I am above everything. And now everything was burning down, and he had to pretend, at least in public, that he was still above it. That is the story of Versailles in the winter of 1709. Not just the frozen wine and the shivering courtiers, we have touched on those. This is the story of a man watching everything he had built beginning to crack, and the extraordinary, unexpected thing he did about it. Let's set the scene properly. Versailles, in January of 1709, was in a condition that its architect would have found mortifying. The palace had been built for spectacle, not survival. Louis had added windows, enormous, tall, dramatically framed windows specifically because they were impressive. They flooded the Hall of Mirrors with light. They made visiting ambassadors gasp. They communicated, architecturally, that here was a man so secure in his power that he could afford to be transparent. Nothing to hide, everything to display. But glass, in the winter of 1709, was not a symbol of power. It was a conduit for cold, the heat generated by the palace's fireplaces, and there were many, burning enormous quantities of wood leaked through those magnificent windows into the frozen January air like water through a sieve. Courtiers gathered near the fireplaces and found that the cold still reached them from behind. The Duchess of Orleans, sitting with her back to the door, her feet in a bearskin sack, wrapped in sable fur, her fire roaring directly in front of her, still shivering, still barely able to hold her pen. But Louis, at 70, insisted on maintaining the rituals. On January the 7th, 2 days after the freeze began, he attempted his usual morning promenade in the gardens of Versailles. This was not a casual stroll. This was a ceremony. The morning walk was part of the elaborate daily choreography of the Sun King's existence, a performance of normalcy and vigour that the entire court was expected to witness and participate in. To skip it would be to admit weakness, and Louis XIV did not admit weakness. His entourage was nearly overcome. The courtiers who flanked him in the frozen gardens, dressed in their court finery because court dress was also ceremonially prescribed, not designed for warmth, were reportedly overwhelmed by the cold within minutes. Louis was forced to abandon the walk and retreat indoors. He would remain largely confined to the palace for the next 2 weeks. His attempted escape to his more private residence at Marly on January the 17th was abandoned before it began. The Sun King was trapped in his own palace by a January morning. There is something I find quietly devastating about that image. Not because I particularly feel sorry for Louis, we will get to his choices in a moment, and they are complicated, but because it speaks to something universal. Here was a man who had spent 60 years constructing an identity so total, so immaculate, so brilliantly maintained, that the identity had become more real than the person, and now the person old, cold, surrounded by courtiers who were also old and cold and deeply worried, had to confront the fact that identity cannot keep you warm. Meanwhile, Saint-Simon, the Duke of Saint-Simon, that endlessly observant and often merciless chronicler of life at Versailles, was watching all of it, taking notes in his characteristic fashion, equal parts literary genius and sharp-tongued judgment, the kind of observer who sees everything and forgives very little. His memoirs record the winter of 1709 with a particular kind of controlled horror. He describes the cold penetrating everywhere, the wine freezing in its decanters, the ink congealing at the tip of writing nibs, the impossible persistence of the frost through February and into March. He describes Louis's growing agitation. The king, who had spent decades hunting, it was one of his genuine pleasures, one of the few activities that seemed to make him feel truly himself rather than ceremonially himself stopped going out entirely. Saint-Simon noted this as a marker of how serious things had become. Louis at 70 was still riding out to hunt in bad weather. The fact that he stopped tells you everything, but Saint-Simon also records something else, something that tells you more about Louis than all the portraits and official histories combined. The pamphlets. In the spring of 1709, as the cold finally began to release its grip and the scale of the famine became undeniable, pamphlets appeared on the gates of Paris, on the doors of churches, nailed to public spaces, posted on the statues of Louis himself, anonymous. Obviously, authorship of such things could get you executed, but prolific and damning. Saint-Simon records that Louis was informed of a flood of placards, his word appearing across Paris, posted on gates, on churches, on public places, and, with particular pointed intention, on the royal statues that stood around the city as monuments to the Sun King's greatness. The text of these pamphlets varied, but the sentiment did not. They blamed Louis directly. They pointed to the years of war, the crushing taxes, the conscription of young men from farms, the grain policies, the courtiers growing fat at Versailles while provincial France starved. One pamphlet, of the kind that circulated widely enough to reach the memoirs of multiple observers, reportedly told the king bluntly he had spent the wealth of France on his own glory, and now the French were dying. The statues of Louis XIV, built to proclaim his permanence and power, were being used as bulletin boards for his people's rage. That is not a subtle metaphor. That is history making its point directly. Now, here is the part of Louis's story in 1709 that I think deserves genuine credit. Not absolution, but credit, because what he did next was genuinely unexpected from a man of his character and his age and his position. He asked for help, publicly, humbly, in language that was extraordinary for a man who had spent 60 years cultivating the image of absolute self-sufficiency. In the summer of 1709, facing the combined disaster of famine and military defeat. The Battle of Malplaquet in September of that year would cost 30,000 lives and leave France worse off than before. Louis did something that had no precedent in his reign. He wrote directly to the French people. He appealed, not as a king issuing commands, but as a man making a request. The language, by the standards of the Sun King, was almost unrecognizable. He told his subjects, in effect, I come to ask for your counsel and your aid in this encounter that involves your safety. I come to ask, Louis XIV, asking to understand how extraordinary that sentence was. You have to understand the man. This was someone who, at the age of 22, had announced after the death of his chief minister that he would be his own prime minister, that he would need no one to rule, that France would be governed by Louis Caesar and Louis alone. He had built an entire system of governance around the idea that the king was the state, that the king's will was the source of all order, that dependence was for lesser men, and in 1709 he was asking, he also did something else, something that, had you described it to a courtier in 1685 at the height of Versailles' golden era, they would have found literally incomprehensible. He melted his gold, the gold dining service of Louis XIV, the extraordinary, gilded, monumental set of plates and serving vessels that represented, in concentrated metallic form, the wealth and magnificence of the French monarchy, was sent to the royal mint, melted down, converted into coin. To buy grain, his courtiers followed suit, with what Saint-Simon diplomatically describes as varying degrees of enthusiasm. Silver plate disappeared from aristocratic dining tables across France as the nobility converted their decorative wealth into something that could actually feed people. Whether this was motivated by genuine solidarity, royal pressure, or simple calculation about what the moment required, probably all three, in different proportions for different people, the effect was real. The symbolic gesture of a king destroying his own symbols of power to fund emergency food purchases is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot, and yet, and this is where I cannot let Louis entirely off the hook, and where history demands honesty, it was also far too little, far too late. The Grain Commission headed by Henri-François d'Aguesseau was not established until the end of April 1709, months after the freeze began. For those months, the provinces were essentially left to manage alone. Local authorities scrambled. Prices rose sixfold in some regions before any meaningful intervention arrived. People were already dying in their tens of thousands before the first inspector reached a provincial grain market. The gold plates were a gesture, a meaningful one, perhaps, but a gesture. There is a counterpoint to the Versailles story that I want to bring in here, because I think it is necessary for balance, and because it is genuinely interesting. Voltaire, the great French philosopher and satirist, writing about 1700 9 years later, offered this line: "This cruel winter of 1709 concluded the despair of the nation." Note the word, concluded, not caused, concluded. Voltaire was making a careful and important distinction. The despair of France in 1709 was not created by the winter. It had been building for decades through wars, through taxation, through the structural failure to reform an agricultural system that left the majority of the population one bad harvest away from starvation at all times. The winter didn't create the despair. It was the final chapter of a very long book. And this, I think, is one of the genuinely important things that 1709 teaches us about power and responsibility. Louis XIV was not a stupid man. He was not an uncaring one in any simple sense. He was a product of his time and his worldview, a man who genuinely believed that his personal glory and France's glory were the same thing, that building Versailles and winning wars and being the greatest king in Europe was how you served your kingdom. He was wrong. But his wrongness was the wrongness of an entire system, not just an individual. The tragedy is that the system was visible. The Marquis de Vauban had mapped it out. The pattern of repeated famines 1661, 1693, 1709 was right there in the historical record. France had been here before, under worse and better circumstances, and the structural vulnerabilities had never been fixed. They had been papered over, managed, survived, and then allowed to reconstitute themselves in time for the next crisis. In that sense, 1709 is not really a story about a cold winter at all. It is a story about a country that kept refusing to look honestly at its own fragility, and what happens when that refusal meets a winter that is not interested in pretending along with you. There is one final detail from Versailles in 1709 that I want to leave you with, because I think it carries something that all the statistics and political analysis cannot. Among the many things that Louis lost in that year, military victories, public legitimacy, the fiction of his own invincibility, he also lost people he loved. and this is rarely mentioned in the accounts of 1709, which focus, understandably, on the political and human disasters of the famine. But Louis, in the years immediately surrounding 1709, lost in rapid succession his son the Grand Dauphin, two of his grandsons, a great-grandson, and his granddaughter-in-law the Duchess of Burgundy, who had been, by all accounts, one of the genuine sources of warmth and life in the aging king's existence. Disease claimed most of them accelerated, weakened, complicated by the general collapse of health and well-being that the cold and famine catalyzed across France. A body weakened by hunger and cold is a body that cannot fight off what it would otherwise survive. Britannica notes something remarkable about Louis in this period. He had been expected, by his enemies and by many of his own courtiers, to collapse under the weight of it all, to become pathetic, to shrink, to finally be revealed as the hollow figurehead that cynics had always suspected beneath the golden ceremonial surface. Instead, the opposite happened. Something genuinely human emerged in the aging king. Having first been the embodiment of a triumphant nation, he surpassed himself by bearing his own suffering and that of his people with something that even his critics had to acknowledge: resolution. Not denial, not performance, something quieter and more honest than either. An old man, in a cold palace, with a kingdom in crisis and a family being taken from him one by one, continuing to govern, continuing to make decisions, asking for help for the first time in 60 years. There is no fairy tale ending here. The winter of 1709 and its aftermath did not redeem Louis XIV. The structural problems he had refused to address remained unaddressed. The famines would come again, 80 years later. Another king named Louis would face another bread crisis, and that one would end very differently indeed. With a guillotine and a revolution, the seeds of the French Revolution were being watered, quietly and invisibly, in the frozen fields of 1709, but that is a story for another day. What we know is that by the summer of 1709, Louis was a changed man in certain quiet ways. Still a king, still Louis, still capable of the grandeur and the stubbornness and the political calculation that had defined his reign. But something had shifted in his understanding of what power actually means, what it can protect you from and what it cannot. And while that shift was happening in Versailles, something else entirely was unfolding in the provinces of France. Something raw and urgent and impossible to contain. Because the famine that the winter had set in motion was not waiting for kings to have their philosophical reckonings. The hunger of 1709 had its own logic, its own momentum, its own terrible mathematics, and the people of France, the millions who had no gold plate to melt, no palace to retreat to, no memoir-writing memoirist to document their suffering, were about to make themselves heard in the oldest and most desperate language available to human beings. That is what we are stepping into next. And it is the part of this story that I find the most human and the most haunting of all. 600,000 people. I keep coming back to that number, and I suspect you do too. It is the kind of number that the human brain cannot really hold all at once. Not because we lack empathy, but because empathy has a natural scale. We can feel for one person, we can feel for a family, for a village, but 600,000, that requires a different kind of engagement, less feeling, more understanding, less grief, more architecture. So let me try to give this number its proper structure, because those 600,000 people did not all die the same way. They did not all die at the same time, and understanding how they died in what sequence, through what mechanism, in what quietly specific circumstances is the only way to truly understand what 1709 was. The historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, one of the most rigorous scholars of French climate and social history, broke the death toll down into 3 distinct waves, 3 separate killings, each with its own logic, and when you see them laid out clearly, the number stops being abstract and starts being devastating in a way that is far more precise. The first wave was the most immediate, and in some ways the most merciful if that word can be stretched to fit anything about 1709. Hypothermia, exposure, the direct physical consequence of temperatures crashing to -20 degrees Celsius across a continent that went to sleep on the evening of January the 5th, with no warning and no preparation whatsoever. Around 100,000 people in France, and this is only France, died in the first weeks. Not from any cascade of consequences, directly from the cold. They froze. Now, I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I think there is a tendency to imagine freezing as somehow peaceful. We have the image in popular culture of someone simply falling asleep in the snow, going gently into that quiet white, and the early stages of hypothermia do involve a kind of confused drowsiness, a heaviness, a loosening of the grip on consciousness. But that image is incomplete and, honestly, not quite honest. What actually happens is this. When the core body temperature drops below 35 degrees Celsius, the brain begins to misfire. Judgment goes first. People in the early stages of severe hypothermia often make baffling decisions. Removing clothing they should keep on, wandering away from shelter toward the open cold. This is documented. This happened in January 1709, when travellers were found by roadsides having apparently stopped moving for reasons that made no sense. The cold had taken their ability to reason before it took their lives. As temperature continues to fall, muscle control goes, then organ function, then consciousness, and then the heart. 100,000 people in France in the first weeks of January 1709. Let that land as a concrete image, a city the size of modern-day Albany, New York, or Providence, Rhode Island gone, in the space of days, from cold alone, and this is the part where I want to pause and ask you something directly. When you think about natural disasters, when you see footage of floods, of earthquakes, of fires, there is an immediacy to them. You see the water rising, the ground shaking, the flames moving. The danger is visible and obviously physical. Cold is different. Cold is invisible. The air looks the same. The sky might even be beautiful, clear and blue and brittle, the way January mornings sometimes are, and people, in 1709, were dying in their homes, in fields they knew, on roads they had walked 100 times, not from something that announced itself with dramatic force, but from the simple, patient removal of warmth from the world around them. There is something about that quietness that I find the most disturbing thing of all. The cold did not roar, it just waited. The second wave came slower, but it killed more. Roughly 200,000 people still in France alone died not from the cold itself, but from what came after the cold, the famine. And here is where the story becomes not just tragic but morally complicated, because the famine of 1709 was not simply a natural consequence of a cold winter. It was partly that, but it was also something else, a human failure layered on top of a natural disaster that made everything worse than it had to be. The grain was gone, this much is true. The winter wheat crop had been destroyed in the frozen ground. The spring planting was delayed by weeks and then months, because the earth was locked solid too deep for any plough. The cattle and livestock that should have been providing dairy and meat had died in their barns. The transport networks that should have been bringing food from regions with surplus into regions of shortage, the rivers, the roads were frozen, blocked, impassable. But there was also grain that existed, hidden grain, hoarded grain. Store owners and merchants who, recognizing that scarcity had arrived, locked away their supplies and waited for prices to rise further before releasing them. The logic was entirely predictable and entirely human. If bread is going to be worth twice as much in 3 weeks, why sell it now? Priests, some of them, not all, sat on parish reserves while their own parishioners starved, waiting to see how the situation would develop. The government's response to this hoarding, when it finally came in late April, was swift and severe. A royal decree required all grain stocks to be declared on pain of fines, or even condemnation to the galleys. Police raided storehouses in Paris. Inspectors were sent to the provinces. Anyone found hoarding grain faced punishment up to and including execution. But the decree came in April. The winter had begun in January. 3 months had passed. The damage, by the time the government intervened with anything resembling effectiveness, had already been done. Think about what those 3 months looked like on the ground. In the little village of Adon, in the region that is now the French department of the Loire, a village of 400 souls, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the priest has baptized every child and buried every grandparent, the parish register for the years. 1709 and 1710 record something that no register should ever have to record. Adon lost 35% of its population in 2 years, in a village of 400 people. That is 140 deaths above normal. 140 people in a community small enough that you would recognize every face, know every name, remember the wedding of this person's parents and the birth of that person's first child. There are now local history projects that have assembled these parish registers from across France. Small books maintained by priests who, whatever their other failings in 1709, kept meticulous records of the dead, and the cumulative picture that emerges from them is not of one disaster, but of thousands of tiny disasters, unfolding simultaneously in villages and towns and neighborhoods across the country, each one local, each one specific, each one real in the way that only the particular, named, known dead can be real. The historian W. Gregory Monahan, in his deep archival study of the famine's impact on Lyon and its surrounding provinces, described 1709 as a prism that refracted the entire social order of France, revealing every tension between city and countryside, between elites and the powerless, between people who had a margin and people who had none. And what the prism revealed, when the light passed through it, was not a society in which the suffering was shared equally. It was a society in which the suffering fell, as suffering almost always does, most heavily on those who were already carrying the most. Reports from across France in the spring and summer of 1709 describe what famine looks like in its final stages. And I want to be honest with you here, because this is where the historical record becomes difficult. Not violent, I am not going to dramatize suffering for its own sake, but difficult in the way that truth is sometimes difficult, when it asks you to look at what human beings become when they have been pushed past every limit. People ate fern soup, not as an unusual dish or a creative adaptation, but as a daily necessity, the boiled liquid of plants that offered almost no nutritional value, consumed because there was nothing else. Accounts circulated of people wandering the countryside searching for grass, for roots, for anything the frozen earth might still yield. The historian Monahan documents people reduced to eating things that should not be food at all. In the letter writing of the period, and the educated women and men of this era wrote letters the way we send messages now. Prolifically and candidly, there are accounts that are almost impossible to read in their plainness. The Duchess of Orleans, who had already described the frozen wine at Versailles in January, wrote again in June of 1709. By that point, the cold had passed, but the famine had not, and she wrote something that has been quoted carefully by historians because it sits at the edge of what can be verified and what was rumoured and what was real in the desperate confusion of a famine year. She described conditions in the provinces as having reached such an extreme that she had been told some of the most desperate acts imaginable had occurred. I'm not going to reproduce those words here, because I think the description of the condition people pushed past the furthest edge of what the human body can endure and still function is more important than any specific claim. What matters is this: a well-connected, educated woman at the court of France, in the summer of 1709, was receiving reports from the provinces that went beyond anything she had ever imagined possible in a European kingdom. And those reports were not fiction. The parish records confirm them, not in their most extreme details, but in the underlying reality they represent. A death toll so severe a collapse so complete that ordinary human behaviour had ceased to apply in some corners of France by the summer of that year. Suicide was documented. The memoir of Saint-Simon mentions it among the miseries of 1709. People who had lost their livestock, their crops, their children, their spouses, and could see no way forward, some of them chose to end it. In a Catholic country, in an era when suicide was considered not just a sin but a crime, its documentation in official records tells you something about the scale of despair that overcame other considerations. And then the third wave, this one was the longest, the quietest, and in some ways the most insidious, because it targeted the survivors. The people who had made it through the cold and through the immediate famine were not necessarily safe. Many of them were simply weakened, their immune systems compromised by months of malnutrition and cold and stress, their bodies running on reserves they had long since depleted. Into that landscape of exhausted, depleted human beings, disease arrived. A flu epidemic had already broken out in Rome in late 1708. Before the freeze even began, the cold and hunger did not create it, but they created ideal conditions for it to spread weakened bodies. Overcrowded shelters, disrupted sanitation as water systems froze and thawed and froze again. The flu became a Europe-wide epidemic through 1709 and into 1710, and alongside the flu came the old killers, the ones that haunted Europe in every era of stress and poverty. Typhoid spread through contaminated water, and the spring thaw of 1709 was a catastrophe for water quality, as everything that had frozen and been sealed under ice was now released into rivers and wells simultaneously. Smallpox, which hit children hardest, and 1709 had already removed many of the adults who might have cared for children. Dysentery, measles, and in a population that had spent months eating almost nothing, or eating things that offered no nutritional value, scurvy, vitamin deficiency, killing people not in dramatic fashion, but through the slow failure of tissues and organs that could no longer maintain themselves. The third wave did not stop in 1709. It ran through 1710, picking off the weakened, the orphaned, the elderly who had survived the cold only to find that survival had cost them everything they needed to keep surviving. 300,000 additional deaths. Beyond the first 100,000 from cold and the 200,000 from famine, 300,000 people who survived the worst winter in 500 years and then died from what came after it, in Paris alone. And this number comes from period demographic records. 51,700 people disappeared from the population rolls between 1709 and 1710, not as a statistic, as real people. Each one of them had a name, a face, a particular way of laughing, or habit of arguing about something trivial, or a child they were raising, or a parent they were caring for. 51,700 of them, in one city, gone, and across France, in those local history archives and parish registers that scholars have spent decades assembling into a coherent picture. The mathematics of loss is staggering. The population of France had been growing before 1709. After 1709, it had not just stopped growing, it had contracted by somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 people, when you account for both deaths and the sharp decline in births, because people who are starving and sick and grieving do not have children at normal rates. The 200,000 fewer births that historians attribute to 1709 are not just a demographic footnote. They are the children who were not born, the generation that was simply not there. There is one final layer to all of this that I want to bring in, because I think it is the most humanly revealing part of the entire story. The government of France, in 1709, did something that deserves acknowledgement even as we note its insufficiency. In a country that had no concept of the modern welfare state, that had no organised social safety net, that had been built on the philosophical premise that the king's glory was equivalent to the people's well-being in that country, emergency bread distributions were organised. Public kitchens were set up in Paris. Free bread was distributed to those who could not pay. Artisans who had lost their work because the cold had shut down every workshop in the city were given what the records call public workshops, essentially emergency employment, paid work that had nothing to do with producing anything useful. But that kept money moving to people who would otherwise have had nothing. These were inadequate measures. They came too late. They were administered through a bureaucracy riddled with exactly the kind of corruption and self-interest that Saint-Simon documented with such acid clarity. But they happened, and from the church side, those priests who hoarded grain notwithstanding, there are also records of parish communities that sold their church silver to buy bread for their congregants, of local clergy who organised the distribution of what they had without waiting for royal instructions, of communities that, facing a disaster beyond anything in anyone's living memory, turned toward each other and did what they could with what they had. The Archbishop of Arles, in a pastoral letter dated the 2nd of June, 1709, wrote to his diocese requesting both prayers and practical relief efforts. He sold church silver. He organised distribution. He was, by the letter of his own theological framework, required to attribute the famine to divine displeasure, and he did, with the formulaic language that was expected of him. But then he moved past the formula and into action. That detail matters to me, because in a story this large and this dark, the human capacity to find something practical to do even imperfect, even insufficient, even riddled with the compromises and corruptions of real human institutions is worth noting, not as a counterweight that cancels out the scale of the suffering, but as the truth of what human communities actually do when the worst arrives. They fail and they respond and they fail again and they keep going, because there is no alternative. 600,000 people, 3 waves, 1 winter. We have now walked through what this disaster was, and how it killed, and who it killed, and at what pace. What we have not yet fully explored is the country it left behind when the dying stopped. The France that emerged from 1709 was not the same France that had entered it. Not politically, not economically, not psychologically. And perhaps most fascinatingly, the changes that 1709 set in motion did not just shape the immediate years that followed, they sent ripples forward through decades, through generations, into events and revolutions and power shifts that people living through them had no idea were connected to a single frozen January 3/4 of a century before. That chain from the winter of 1709 to the world we recognize today is what we are following next. Here is something that historians sometimes call the greatest irony of the early 18th century. The man who came closest to stopping Russia from becoming a world power, who came within a winter's breath of changing the entire course of European history, was not defeated by a better general. He was not defeated by superior strategy, or superior numbers, or superior weapons. He was defeated by a season, by the same winter that was freezing wine in Versailles and killing birds over Venice and locking ships in Copenhagen harbour. His name was Charles XII of Sweden. He was 26 years old when the campaign began, and for a brief, dazzling window of time, he was arguably the most dangerous man alive. To understand what the winter of 1709 did to Charles XII, you first have to understand what Charles XII was, because without that context, the story of his collapse just sounds like a general who made bad decisions in cold weather, and it was much more than that. Sweden in the early 18th century was a military superpower that punched so far above its population weight that it genuinely defies modern intuition. A country of perhaps 2 million people, smaller than many modern American cities, had spent the previous century building the most disciplined, aggressive, and tactically sophisticated army in Europe. Under Charles XI, his father, and then under Charles himself, the army had been honed into something almost uniquely formidable. The Karelians, as Swedish soldiers of this era were known, were trained in a style of warfare built around one principle: attack, always attack, close the distance, fix the bayonet, trust your training and your comrades and your king. Charles XII had never lost a battle. Let that sink in for a moment. This was a man who, at the age of 18, had knocked Denmark out of a war in a matter of weeks, who had then turned and annihilated a Russian army 5 times his size at the Battle of Narva in the year 1700, at the very start of the century, who had systematically dismembered the coalition arrayed against him, defeating Poland, Saxony, and Denmark-Norway in sequence, forcing their rulers to his terms by 1708. When he turned his attention definitively toward Russia, Charles XII had been fighting wars for 8 years and had never been beaten. Peter the Great of Russia had been watching all of this, carefully, with great attention and, in certain moments, with what can only be described as appropriate terror, Peter offered peace, multiple times, in 1706, after Sweden had forced Augustus II of Saxony-Poland to surrender and effectively exit the war. Peter had sent envoys suggesting terms. He was willing to give back almost everything Russia had taken, except for one thing, the land around St. Petersburg, the new city he was building on the Baltic coast, the city he called his window to the west. That he would not surrender. Charles refused. He did not want territory negotiated at a table. He wanted Moscow. He wanted to destroy Russian military capacity so completely that it could never threaten Sweden again. He wanted a peace that was not an agreement but a submission. And so in August of 1707, with an army of roughly 44,000 of the best soldiers in Europe, Charles XII marched east, toward Russia, toward Moscow, toward what he was quite confident would be the last and greatest campaign of his already remarkable career. Peter responded with something that had a long and distinguished future ahead of it. Scorched earth, every village in the path of the Swedish advance was destroyed. Crops were burned, food stores were hidden or contaminated, livestock was driven away. The Russians retreated continuously, refusing to engage in the pitched battle that Charles wanted, pulling his army deeper into a landscape that offered nothing. No food, no shelter, no supplies, no easy decision. The Swedish historian Peter Englund, in his celebrated study of Poltava, described this phase of the campaign with a kind of poetic precision. The Swedes were marching through a countryside that had been systematically turned against them, their supply lines stretching back across hundreds of miles of hostile, barren territory, their provisions dwindling with every day they advanced and failed to bring Peter to a decisive fight. And then winter arrived, the same winter that was freezing the Mediterranean, the same cold that had shattered church bells in France and locked ships in the Adriatic. In Ukraine, where the Swedish army was camped in the open country south of the Dnieper River, temperatures dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius, not -12, as in London, not -20, as in Paris. Negative 30. Peter Englund's account of what the Swedish camp looked like during those weeks is one of the most chilling passages in military history. He writes that if soldiers failed to find any shelter, any cranny in the frozen earth, any hut that had not already been stripped bare by the Russians, they had to stand outside in the extreme cold under open sky. Every morning, sleds loaded with rigid corpses were driven from the camp to be hidden in hillside cavities because the ground was too frozen to bury anyone properly. The field surgeons worked without rest. Barrels, he writes this explicitly, barrels filled with amputated limbs, fingers and toes and noses, and worse, taken from the living victims of frostbite, barrels of amputated limbs. This was what a Swedish camp looked like in January of 1709. Charles himself suffered frostbite. He reportedly saved his nose and cheeks by rubbing them with snow, a technique documented by multiple sources, which tells you something about how close to catastrophe even the king came. He later took a musket ball to the foot in a skirmish, a wound that incapacitated him physically at the worst possible moment. By April of 1709, when the worst of the cold had finally released its grip on the Ukrainian steppe, the Swedish army had been reduced from roughly 44,000 men to somewhere between 19,000 and 24,000. The exact numbers vary by source. Around 3,000 men had frozen to death. Another 2,000 had been permanently crippled by frostbite. Horses had died by the hundreds, gutting the cavalry and the supply trains simultaneously. Artillery ammunition, much of which had already been lost when a crucial supply column was ambushed and destroyed by the Russians at the Battle of Lesnaia the previous October, was now critically short. Some Swedish cannon had only a handful of rounds left. Let me put a different frame around those numbers. Charles XII had lost more than half his army not to fighting, but to weather, to a single winter, to the same cold that was killing peasants in France and trapping sailors in Copenhagen harbour. And he had not yet faced Peter's main army. Here is the question I find myself asking whenever I sit with this story, and it's genuinely interesting, so I want to ask it out loud. Charles XII was brilliant. He was arguably the best tactical battlefield commander of his generation, maybe of his century. His soldiers were the finest in Europe. They were outnumbered, yes, but they had won at worse odds before at Narva. With 5-1 against them, they had crushed the Russians. So why, in the spring of 1709, did Charles not do the sensible thing and retreat? Why did he not pull back to the Baltic, resupply, regroup, and come back in better condition? The answer, I think, is one of the most fascinating character studies in all of military history. Charles XII had built his identity, his entire sense of self and purpose around the idea of the attack. Never retreat, never negotiate from weakness, never pause in a campaign to consolidate what you have. His own historians noted it. The very qualities that made him an extraordinary battlefield commander made him constitutionally incapable of doing the strategically sensible thing when the strategically sensible thing required acknowledging that the situation had changed. He could not see the winter as a reason to stop. He could not allow himself to feel the full weight of what those barrels of amputated limbs represented, that his army was no longer the army it had been, that the mathematics of the campaign had shifted against him in ways that no amount of tactical brilliance could fully overcome. And so in the spring of 1709, with 19,000 to 24,000 exhausted, frostbitten, undersupplied men, Charles XII laid siege to the Russian fortress town of Poltava. Peter the Great, watching from a distance, did not hesitate. He assembled a force of between 45,000 and 80,000 men, the sources vary, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and marched to relieve Poltava. He built an elaborate system of field fortifications, the kind of systematic defensive engineering that his westernization reforms had introduced to Russia. He created interlocking defensive positions that the Swedes, to win, would have to charge directly into exactly the kind of frontal assault that Carolean tactics were built around, except now against an army that had learned from Narva and was fully prepared for what was coming. On June the 27th, 1709, by the old calendar July the 8th by the modern one, the Battle of Poltava began. What happened that morning was not, at first, a complete disaster for the Swedes. The Caroleans attacked with the ferocity and discipline that had defined them for a generation. On the left flank, Swedish infantry broke through the Russian positions and drove the defenders back. For a brief moment, the outcome hung genuinely uncertain. Then things began to go wrong in cascading fashion. Confusion in the command structure. Charles was incapacitated by his foot wound and unable to direct the battle personally, leaving command to Field Marshal Carl Gustav Renskiöld, who then had a catastrophic breakdown in communication with one of his subordinate generals. A detachment of Swedish infantry became separated from the main force, was surrounded, and was forced to surrender. The artillery was almost silent, its ammunition exhausted, and Peter, who had positioned himself with the Novgorod regiment on the left flank, ordered his full force out of its fortifications and into a general advance. 45,000 Russians pouring from their fieldworks, cannon firing, infantry advancing in disciplined lines, the weight of numbers crushing what remained of Swedish momentum. The battle lasted roughly 2 hours. At the end of it, the Swedish army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Roughly 9,000 Swedes were killed or wounded on the field. The rest, 12,000 men, were surrounded at the Dnieper River 3 days later and surrendered. Charles XII escaped across the river with approximately 1,500 followers and fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he would remain in exile for 5 years, spinning plans that never came to anything. Sweden never recovered its great power status. Never. Peter the Great walked the battlefield after the fighting was done, and he is reported to have said something that I think deserves to be in any accounting of what 1709 meant for the world. He said, "This victory has laid the final stone in the foundations of St. Petersburg." St. Petersburg, the city he had refused to surrender to Charles, the city he had founded in 1703 on the shores of the Baltic, which he called his window to the west, the city that would become the capital of the Russian Empire in 1712, just 3 years after Poltava, and would remain Russia's westward-looking face for the next 2 centuries. The city that housed the Winter Palace, that became the centre of Russian art and culture and imperial ambition, that was built in the European style by European architects as a statement that Russia was not an Asian backwater, but a European power with every intention of being taken seriously. All of it rested on what happened at Poltava, and what happened at Poltava rested, in very significant part, on what had happened to the Swedish army during the winter of 1708 and 1709, the cold that froze wine in Versailles and killed birds over Venice and buried palm trees in Portugal had simultaneously, on the Ukrainian steppe, been doing something else. It had been dismantling the only force capable of stopping Peter the Great from remaking the map of northern Europe. Do you see the shape of it? The winter of 1709 was not just a weather event. It was a geopolitical event. It was a hinge in history, the kind of moment where multiple things that seem entirely unrelated are actually being driven by the same invisible force. And the result is a permanent shift in how power is arranged across an entire civilization. Sweden fell, Russia rose, those facts are well known. What is less appreciated is the mechanism. A winter so cold that an army of the finest soldiers in Europe was reduced to an exhausted remnant before it ever faced its true enemy. And here is the broader point I want to sit with for a moment before we move on. Military historians sometimes debate whether the Battle of Poltava was inevitable, whether Charles, even with a full-strength army, could have beaten Peter's reformed Russians. Maybe not. Maybe the outcome was coming regardless. Peter had been learning, building, modernizing. Russian capacity had grown enormously since Narva. But here is what I believe, and I think the evidence supports it. Without the winter of 1709, the battle at Poltava looks fundamentally different. Maybe Charles still loses, but he loses with 40,000 men, with full artillery, with cavalry that can maneuver. He loses, perhaps, at a cost so severe to Peter that Russia's subsequent expansion is delayed by a decade, or perhaps the battle never happens at all, perhaps with a full, rested, supplied Swedish army in the field, Peter chooses to keep retreating, to keep negotiating, until something breaks differently. We will never know, because the winter happened, and the winter was not merciful to the side that needed it to be merciful. The consequences of Poltava echo in ways that are genuinely difficult to fully trace, because they run through 300 years of history. Russia's emergence as a great power and all the alliances, wars, revolutions, and global realignments that followed from it begins in significant measure in Ukraine. In 1709, in a winter that the Swedish army could not survive, the Swedish Empire, painstakingly built over a century of warfare, began to unravel. Territory after territory was lost. Denmark rejoined the war. Prussia entered. Within 12 years, Sweden had been stripped of most of its Baltic holdings. The country that had been the dominant force in northern Europe for half a century became, gradually and painfully, the peaceful Scandinavian nation we know today, a transformation so complete that it requires effort to remember what Sweden once was. And on the other side of that transformation, Russia declared itself an empire in 1721. Peter took the title emperor, the country that, just 20 years earlier, had been humiliated at Narva was now the preeminent power of the northern half of Europe. It would remain so, in various forms, for the next 300 years. All of that, from one winter, but the story of 1709 does not end with armies and empires and battles won and lost. Because while Charles XII was watching his soldiers freeze on the Ukrainian steppe, and while Peter the Great was building his window to the west on the Baltic shore, something else was happening, something quieter, more personal, and in some ways more lasting in its human significance. The ordinary people of France and Germany and England, the ones who had no armies and no thrones and no role in the grand geopolitical chess match being played out on the battlefields of 1709, were making their own decisions about what to do when the world offers you nothing but cold and hunger and the necessity of beginning again somewhere else. Their story is the one that reaches the farthest, and it is the one we're heading into next. Of all the things the winter of 1709 set in motion, the one that I find personally most astonishing and the one that connects most directly to the country many of you are living in right now is this. It helped populate America, not metaphorically, literally. The people who left the German Rhineland in the spring and summer of 1709, fleeing the combination of war devastation, failed harvests, crushing taxes, and the memory of the worst winter in 5 centuries, those people became the first large wave of German-speaking immigrants to colonial America. Their descendants, spread across Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia and the Carolinas, helped shape what would become the United States in ways that are still visible today. If you have ever driven through Pennsylvania Dutch country, if you have ever seen an Amish buggy on a country road, if you have ever eaten shoofly pie, or heard someone speak Pennsylvania German, or noticed a hex sign on a barn in Lancaster County, you're looking at something that traces its roots, in part, to a frozen January in 1709. That connection is real, and the story of how it happened is one of the most human stories in this entire chronicle. Let me set the scene properly. The Rhineland in the spring of 1709 was a landscape of compounding miseries. The winter had destroyed the harvest of the previous autumn. The olive trees were dead. The vineyards were blackened ruins. Livestock had frozen in barns. The ground was still too cold and too saturated from the melting ice to accept new planting. And layered over all of that was the damage from decades of war, most recently the War of the Spanish Succession, which had sent French and Allied armies marching through the Rhineland repeatedly, burning and looting as they went. One of the towns on the Rhine River was Oppenheim, a place that, even in 1709, still lay partially in ruins from a French attack 20 years earlier. When you've been bombed within living memory and then the worst winter in 500 years arrives, the calculus of staying versus leaving shifts, and it shifted for thousands of families across the entire Rhineland region. The trigger, specifically, was a book. In early 1709, a pamphlet began circulating through the villages of southwestern Germany, the Palatinate, Baden, Hesse, the smaller principalities along the Rhine. It was written by a Lutheran minister named Joshua Kocherthal, and it described something that, to a farmer who had just watched his crops freeze in the ground, must have sounded almost impossibly good. Free land in the American colonies, offered by the benevolent Queen Anne of England, to German Protestant settlers willing to make the journey. The book was not exactly lying. Kocherthal had actually led a small group of 50 German Lutherans to New York the previous year, and they had received land along the Hudson River. What his book implied, and this implication was probably deliberate, since Kocherthal was a persuasive writer, was that Queen Anne would extend the same generosity to any German Protestant willing to come. She had not, in fact, promised any such thing, but in the spring of 1709, in a Rhineland village where the seed grain had frozen, where the men who should be ploughing the fields had been conscripted into somebody else's war, where the local lord was demanding taxes that nobody had any capacity to pay the details of what the Queen had actually promised, felt less urgent than what the book said she had promised. Within weeks, thousands of families had made their decision. Now pause for a moment and think about what that decision actually meant. You are a German farmer in the spring of 1709. You have a family. You have a farm that is barely a farm anymore. The trees are dead. The vines are dead. The fields are saturated and unworkable. You have debts. You have a landlord. You have a government that has been bleeding you dry for years to fund a war you had no voice in starting. And someone hands you a pamphlet that says, there is a place. It is called the Carolinas, or New York, or America. The pamphlet is somewhat vague on geography, which should perhaps have been a warning sign, and there is land there, and it is free, and the Queen of England wants you to have it. What do? You pack what you can carry. You load your family into a small boat. You float down the Rhine River, the same Rhine that, in January, had been frozen solid enough to walk across on foot toward Rotterdam, and then, eventually, toward London, and then, you hope, toward something better. The first boats packed with refugees began arriving in the Dutch city of Rotterdam in the spring of 1709. By summer, they were flooding into London. The scale of the movement astonished everyone, including the British government, which had not anticipated anything remotely approaching this. Official British records show a combined total of over 13,000 refugees making their way to England in the summer of 1709 alone. Some estimates, counting those who turned back or took other routes, put the total number who set out from their Rhineland homes at close to 30,000 people, driven from their homeland by a winter. London in the summer of 1709 was not prepared for 30,000 German refugees. The government scrambled. Emergency tent camps were set up on the open fields of Blackheath and Camberwell. South of the city, army tents, row after row after row, filled with German-speaking families who had arrived half-starved and in clothing so ragged that one English observer noted that Londoners could identify them from a distance simply by what they were wearing. The city's initial reaction was, as these things often are, a mixture of genuine compassion and practical alarm. Church collections were taken up. A committee was established to coordinate their settlement and find them employment. Londoners came out to the camps at Blackheath in considerable numbers, not all of them charitably motivated, but curious, which is perhaps the second best response after charity. The writer Daniel Defoe, who would later write Robinson Crusoe, if that name rings a bell, became involved in the public conversation about the refugees, publishing a tract called A Brief History of the Poor Palatine Refugees. Defoe argued for welcoming them, framing them as Protestant victims of French Catholic aggression, deserving of British solidarity. He was not above some creative enhancement of their story to make it more sympathetic, but his advocacy was genuine. The broader public sentiment in London was more complicated. People wrote letters to friends describing the Germans with a range of reactions: pity, sympathy, suspicion, xenophobia. One Englishman wrote that his region was full of them and that people called them gypsies. Not knowing their language and seeing their poverty, the camps became something of a tourist attraction in a disturbing way, with upper-class Londoners visiting to observe the refugees the way they might have visited a menagerie. And then, as summer wore on, the British government discovered something inconvenient. A significant proportion of the refugees were Catholic, not Protestant victims of French Catholic persecution at all, just Catholic Germans, who had come because they were hungry and wanted land. The political complications were immediate. England was a Protestant country in a Protestant war against Catholic France. Welcoming Catholic German refugees was difficult to sell to the public and to Parliament. The government began separating out the Catholics and, eventually, sending them back. Around 3,500 refugees were returned to Germany. Remember, to the same place they had just fled. For those who remained, the Protestants, the Lutherans, the Reformed Germans, The small minority of Mennonites and Baptists the British government tried to figure out what to do with them. The solutions it landed on were scattered and imperfect, in the way that governmental solutions to humanitarian crises often are. 3,000 Palatines were transported to Ireland, settled on unimproved agricultural land in County Limerick, near the towns of Adair and Rathkeil. Some of their descendants are still there today, still known in those parts as the German Palatines, still with Germanic surnames, still with a reputation, as one 19th century visitor noted, for being the most wealthy and prosperous farmers in the county of Limerick. A winter in Germany drove families to Ireland, and 3 centuries later their descendants are still farming the same Irish soil. I find that extraordinary. 650 Palatines were transported to North Carolina to help found a settlement called New Bern. Their arrival was troubled from the start, and their first years were devastating in the terrible year of 1711, when the Tuscarora people of the region rose against the colonial settlements. Many of the Palatine colonists at New Bern were killed. 7,000 of those who'd come to England returned to Germany. As the records put it, half naked and in despondency, the dream had not materialized. The free land was not waiting. The Queen had not, in fact, offered what the Golden Book had implied. They went home to whatever was left of home, and somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000, the records are imprecise, died in England itself, from disease, from malnutrition, from the accumulated damage of a terrible journey following a terrible winter. 10,000 people who had crossed an entire continent seeking safety, who had made it to London and to the camps at Blackheath, and died there without ever seeing America. But roughly 3,000 of them made it. In December of 1709, they were loaded onto 10 ships in London Harbour. They set sail on the 25th of December, a Christmas departure for an uncertain destination. It would be a 6-month voyage, because these were not wealthy passengers booking comfortable cabins. These were people travelling in the cheapest possible conditions on ships that were not designed for passenger comfort. The conditions on board were, by multiple accounts, appalling. Typhus swept through the ships. Food was inadequate. Water was contaminated. Children died in numbers that the records note with a terrible matter-of-factness. By the time the fleet arrived in New York Harbour in June of 1710, an estimated 1,700 of the original passengers had died at sea or immediately upon landing. They arrived sick, depleted, in debt because the British government had agreed to transport them in exchange for several years of indentured labour, which meant that on top of everything else, they now owed work to the Crown before they could pursue their own lives. The survivors, around 2,100, by the most careful estimates, were settled in work camps along the Hudson River. They were assigned to produce naval tar and hemp, the materials the British Navy needed for its ships. This is not what they had come for. They had come for land of their own, for the farms that Koshothal's Golden Book had promised them. And when it became clear that the Naval Stores project was not what had been advertised, they did what people who have already survived a winter in the Rhineland and a 6-month ocean voyage, and the death of half their travelling companions, tend to do. They refused. This is the part of the story that I love most, and I think it deserves a moment. These were people who had lost almost everything, who had fled a frozen homeland, camped in London fields, watched their children die on ships, and arrived in a new country in debt and exhausted. And when the arrangement they had been put into turned out to be not what they had been told, they organised, they petitioned, they moved, they left the Hudson River work camps, they bought land directly from the Mohawk people of the Iroquois Confederacy, bypassing the colonial land system entirely, and settled in the Schoharie Valley of what is now upstate New York. Then, when colonial officials tried to deny the legitimacy of their purchases and their presence, some of them moved again, into Pennsylvania, into Virginia, into the Shenandoah Valley, into the frontier. Historian Philip Otternes, in his meticulous study of this migration called Becoming German, documented something fascinating about what happened to these people's identity in the process. In Germany, They had not really thought of themselves as German. They had been Palatines, or Lutherans, or people from a specific village on the Rhine. They had not had a shared German identity because no such identity existed in any coherent political form in the early 18th century. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of hundreds of small states, each with its own ruler and customs and local identity. But in America, the British government's census takers lumped them all together. The pamphlets called them Palatines. The newspapers called them Germans. And gradually, in the strange alchemy of migration and displacement, they became what the new country called them. They became German Americans, the first ones. The people whose arrival in 1710 represents the first substantial migration of German speakers to colonial America. By 1775, Germans constituted roughly 1/3 of the population of Pennsylvania, 1/3 from a movement that began, in significant measure, because a winter froze the Rhineland in 1709. And here is the connection to today that I want to sit with for just a moment. The Pennsylvania Dutch country that exists in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Right now, those farms and communities and distinctive hex sign barns and horse-drawn buggies and roadside markets, full of scrapple and whoopie pies, all of that traces its cultural roots to the German Rhineland. The Pennsylvania Dutch language, which despite its name is not Dutch at all, but a form of German that has evolved over 3 centuries of American life, derives primarily from the Palatine German dialects brought by these immigrants and those who followed them. The Amish communities of Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania, with their distinctive way of life, their horses, their rejection of certain technologies, their extraordinary craftsmanship descend from Swiss and German Anabaptist communities who emigrated to Pennsylvania in waves that the 1709 migration helped trigger and establish. German Americans today number approximately 49 million people, the single largest ancestry group in the United States, accounting for roughly 15% of the total population. Not all of them trace their ancestry to the 1709 migration. Obviously, German immigration continued in waves through the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, but the 1709 migration was the first substantial wave. It established the communities, the churches, the land patterns, the cultural presence that made subsequent German immigration easier and more natural. And behind all of that, behind the Amish farms and the Pennsylvania Dutch language and the 49 million Americans of German descent lies, at the beginning of the chain, a winter, a frozen January in 1709 that made staying in the Rhineland impossible, and made the risk of an Atlantic crossing look, by comparison, survivable. There is something I keep coming back to in this story, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters. The Palatine migration of 1709 was, in the most immediate sense, a catastrophe. 10,000 people died trying to get to England. 1,700 more died on the ships to New York. The work camps were miserable. The indenture was exploitative. The whole enterprise was full of broken promises and governmental indifference, and casual cruelty toward people who had already suffered an enormous amount. And yet, and this is the part that is genuinely complicated, out of that catastrophe came something: communities, farms, churches, a cultural presence in America that has been woven into the fabric of the country for more than 3 centuries. People who refused to be what the authorities told them to be, who bought land from the Mohawks when the colonial system would not give it to them, who moved from New York to Pennsylvania to Virginia to the frontier, always seeking the thing they had left the Rhineland to find: soil they could work, land they could own, a life that belonged to them. That stubbornness, that specific, determined, almost infuriating refusal to accept what circumstances handed them, is not a German trait or a Palatine trait or any ethnic trait. It is a human trait. It is what humans do when they have been pushed to the edge and survived. They push back. The winter of 1709 pushed 30,000 people out of their homeland. Most of them did not make it to America. But the ones who did and the millions of descendants who followed in subsequent generations helped build something now. We've been talking about the very large canvas of 1709, the empires and armies and migrations and political upheavals. But there is one dimension of this story we've not yet explored, and it is, in some ways, the most intimate, the most quietly devastating. The ordinary people of France who did not leave, who could not leave, because they had nowhere to go and no pamphlet promising them land elsewhere, lived through the winter and the famine and the disease, and emerged on the other side into a world that had been permanently altered. Their lives, their villages, their relationships to the land and to power and to the future, all of it had changed. What did that ordinary life look like? What did it feel like to be one of the unnamed survivors? And what did France and Europe learn from all of this? If it learned anything at all, that is the chapter we're moving into next, and it is the one that brings us closest, I think, to understanding why any of this matters to the world we live in right now. Somewhere in the spring of 1710, let's say, it is April. Because April in France is when the world traditionally begins to remember how to be green. Again, a woman is walking through a field outside a village in the Loire Valley. She is not young. The winter has aged her in ways that go beyond the calendar. She has buried someone this year, perhaps more than one person. The field she's walking through is technically her field, or her husband's field, or what is left of both. The earth beneath her feet is soft now, finally. Mercifully soft after months of being locked solid to a depth that no spade could penetrate. She is looking at it the way you look at something you are not entirely sure you can trust yet. Can she plant here? Is the soil ruined? Will the seeds take hold in ground that spent 4 months frozen like iron? She does not know. Nobody does. Exactly. The agronomists of the 18th century did not have soil chemistry. What they had was experience, and in 1710, their experience did not include a winter like the one they had just survived. Everything was guesswork. Every planting decision was a hope wrapped in uncertainty. She plants anyway, because what else do you do? This, I think, is the part of the story of 1709 that gets the least attention and deserves the most. Not the wine freezing, not the armies collapsing, not the kings melting their gold plates. Those are the dramatic elements, and they are real and they matter. But the actual lived experience of the years 1709, 1710, and 1711 for the millions of ordinary French men and women who survived was something quieter, longer, and in many ways more difficult than any single dramatic event. It was the experience of rebuilding a life when you've run out of almost everything. Money, seed grain, livestock, family members, time, and it is worth spending some time with that experience, because it is where the real human cost of the catastrophe is ultimately measured. The thaw, when it finally came in April 1709, was not the relief it should have been. Picture what happens when an entire continent's worth of ice and snow accumulated over 4 months, covering everything from England to Russia, begins to melt simultaneously. The ground is frozen more than a meter deep. That frozen ground cannot absorb meltwater. It simply cannot. So every drop of snowmelt runs off the surface, joins every other drop, and finds the lowest point available. In France, those lowest points were rivers. The Loire, the Rhône, the Seine. The Garonne, all of them rose with extraordinary speed. Near Lyon, the Saône flooded the valley around Vase with such force that blocks of ice the size of 2 men were carried downstream, smashing against the bridges. Lyon lost 3 bridges in those floods. Boats that had been moored along the riverbanks were either smashed to splinters or carried away entirely. The flooding was not just destructive in the immediate sense. It was destructive in the long agricultural sense. Fields that should have been receiving the spring planting were under water. Seeds that had been carefully hoarded through the winter were ruined when storage areas were inundated. And the ground, when it finally emerged from beneath the floodwater soggy, saturated, altered by the freeze-thaw cycle, was not the same ground that had been there in December. The soil structure had been damaged. The microorganism communities that healthy agricultural soil depends on had been disrupted. The spring planting of 1709, which everyone desperately needed to rescue them from the famine the winter had created, was delayed, partial, and in many areas simply failed. By the summer of 1709, the mathematical reality of the food situation had become brutally clear to anyone willing to look at the numbers. France needed to import grain. There was no other option. And here is where something almost darkly comic enters the story. If you have a dark enough sense of humour, France was at war with England. The War of the Spanish Succession had been grinding on for 8 years. England and France were enemies. They had been shooting at each other's soldiers at the Battle of Malplaquet only that September, and yet grain convoys were moving from England to France because France was starving and England had grain to sell, and business even in the 18th century has a way of crossing political lines when the price is right. Voltaire, writing about 1709 in his History of the Reign of Louis XIV, noted this with the specific kind of dry wit that only a French intellectual of the Enlightenment could produce. The nation had bought grain from its enemies. The Dutch had supplied it. The Turks had supplied it. France, the greatest kingdom in Europe, had been reduced to buying food from the Ottoman Empire, and Louis XIV, who had spent decades projecting the image of absolute self-sufficiency, had sent diplomats with begging bowls to foreign courts. I do not say this to mock Louis. I say it because it is one of the most vivid illustrations I know of how completely a natural disaster can override the political structures and the pride and the pretensions that ordinarily govern human behaviour. When people are starving, the geography of alliances becomes negotiable. Let me ask you something personal. Have you ever been through a period not a catastrophe on this scale, but something that stripped away so many of the things you had built and assumed and relied upon that you had to figure out who you were without them? A job loss, maybe a relationship ending, moving to a completely new place, an illness, something that made you go back to basics in a way you had not done since you were very young. There is a particular quality to that experience, a kind of enforced clarity. When the usual scaffolding is gone, you find out which things were actually holding you up and which things were just decorative. And the people around you, the ones who show up, the ones who do not, the communities that hold together and the ones that fall apart, you see them with a precision you had never had before. That is what the survivors of 1709 were living through. And what the historical record, particularly the local studies built from parish registers and household accounts and court documents, shows is something genuinely surprising. The communities that held together were not always the wealthiest or the best positioned. They were often the most cohesive. The villages where the parish priest had organised a communal grain store before the crisis hit. The neighbourhoods in Lyon or Paris where the tradition of mutual aid of neighbours feeding neighbours, of extended family networks absorbing the orphan children of those who had died was strongest. The places where people trusted each other enough to share what little remained, rather than hoarding it individually. And the communities that fragmented were not always the poorest. They were often the most atomized. The places where the social fabric had already been worn thin by years of war and taxation, and forced conscription of young men who had not come back. The winter of 1709, in other words, did not create either solidarity or selfishness. It revealed which one was already present. The recovery statistics, looked at in aggregate, are both reassuring and sobering. France's population, which had been growing before 1709, contracted sharply in 1709 and 1710. The roughly 800,000 person deficit, 600,000 direct deaths, 200,000 fewer births was a demographic wound that took years to heal. Marriages, which had been put off or prevented during the crisis, accelerated in 1710 and 1711 as survivors sought to reconstitute households and restart the basic human project of building a family. Births rose in the years following the crisis, as they typically do after catastrophes, in a pattern that demographers have documented across many eras and many cultures. By the early 1720s, French population growth had resumed. The food situation had stabilized. The worst harvests were behind them. The vineyards were slowly being replanted. It takes years for a grapevine to mature and produce, so the wine regions of France did not recover quickly, but they recovered. The olive groves of Provence, similarly, took decades to restore. The memory of the Great Winter would outlast the physical damage by a generation. In England, the recovery was similarly slow. The 23% decline in per capita gross domestic product that England experienced in 1709 took roughly a decade to reverse. The agricultural economy had been so thoroughly disrupted that normal productivity did not resume until the late 1710s in many regions. Britannica makes an observation that I find genuinely significant. One of the measurable consequences of 1709 was the near disappearance of widespread famine in France after that year. After 1709, France experienced no comparable mass mortality crisis until the Revolution itself, and even the revolutionary famines were not on the scale of 1693 or 1709. Whether this was due to genuine policy reform, to better weather in the subsequent decades, to gradual agricultural improvement, or simply to the terrible efficiency with which 1709 had eliminated the most vulnerable members of the population, historians debate. Probably all of these played a role, but there is a darker thread running through the recovery story, and I cannot in good conscience leave it out, because 1709 was, as the historian's careful phrase puts it, the last great famine of the Ancien Régime. But it was not the last time France would face the combination of failed harvests, bread shortages, grain hoarding, and governmental inadequacy that made 1709 so lethal. Those conditions would return. They would return in 1740. They would return in 1788. And in 1788 and 1789, the combination would finally ignite something that no army of royal guards could put out. I want to be careful here, because the connection between 1709 and 1789 is not a straight line. It would be too simple to say. The winter of 1709 caused the French Revolution. History does not work that cleanly. 80 years is a long time. Many things happened between a frozen January in 1709 and the storming of the Bastille in 1789, but there is a genuine connection, and it works like this. The winter of 1709 exposed, with devastating clarity, the structural flaws of the French food system and the French political system, the dependence on cereal monoculture, the inadequacy of grain storage and distribution, the inability of the government to respond effectively to a crisis until long after the damage was done, the gap between the life of the nobility at Versailles and the life of a peasant in the Loire Valley. Those structural flaws were not fixed after 1709. They were patched over, survived, and allowed to reconstitute themselves. Louis XIV died in 1715, 6 years after the Great Winter, still King of France. The kingdom still scarred but still standing. His successors Louis XV and then Louis XVI inherited a system that had survived 1709 but had not fundamentally reformed because of it. And then, in the winter of 1788, 80 years later, another brutal cold descended on France. Another harvest failed. Bread prices rose to levels that consumed 70 to 90% of a labourer's daily wages. Another population stood at the edge of starvation. And this time, the conditions were different in one crucial respect. The people of France in 1789 were not just hungry. They were educated. They had been reading Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu. They had seen what had happened in America. They had a vocabulary liberty, equality, rights that the starving peasants of 1709 had not possessed. When the bread riots began in 1789, they did not stop at bread riots. They became something else. I am not saying that the memory of 1709 was consciously present in the minds of the men and women who stormed the Bastille. Most of them were too young to remember it directly, and their grandparents' stories of the Great Winter had been filtered through 80 years of family memory. but the structural resentments, the deep, bone-level understanding that the system was rigged against the people who did the actual work of feeding France. Those resentments had been accumulating since 1709 and before. The winter of 1709 had not created them, but it had sharpened them, made them visceral and specific, given them the weight of lived catastrophic experience. A historian I respect put it this way: the French Revolution did not happen because France was uniquely oppressed. It happened because France had been taught, repeatedly and painfully, exactly what its oppression cost in human lives. And the accounting had been running for a very long time. There is one more element of the post-1709 story I want to bring in, because it speaks to something that I think is genuinely hopeful. In the aftermath of the Great Winter, something happened in the way Europeans began to think about weather, about climate, and about the relationship between human communities and the natural world. Not a dramatic paradigm shift, this was the early 18th century, and paradigm shifts took longer then, but a change, quiet and incremental, in the way that governments and intellectuals and scientists approach these questions. The Maunder Minimum era, that 70-year period of reduced solar activity that had been part of the background to 1709, ended around 1715, the Little Ice Age. While it would persist in a milder form for another century and a half, entered a somewhat less extreme phase after 1720. Winters remained cold by modern standards, but they were not 1709 cold, and in the years after 1709, the first systematic efforts to understand weather as something that could be measured, recorded, and potentially predicted began to take institutional form. The network of weather observers that William Derham had been part of, recording temperatures 3 times a day in Upminster, sending his data to the Royal Society in London, expanded. More people across more places began keeping systematic weather records. This discipline that would eventually become meteorology had its roots in exactly this impulse. If we had known this was coming, some of us would still be alive. It did not produce immediate results. Centuries would pass before that impulse produced anything like what we now take for granted: a 7-day forecast, a hurricane warning, a polar vortex alert. But the direction had been set. The winter of 1709 had demonstrated, in the most brutal possible way, what ignorance of the natural world costs, and the response tentative, slow, incomplete, but real, was to begin trying to understand it better. That woman in the field, in April of 1710, planting her seeds in uncertain ground, hoping that what she puts into the earth will come back as something edible. She does not know that the winter she has survived will be remembered 300 years later. She does not know that historians will someday assemble the parish registers of her village into a picture of what happened to her community. She does not know that the structural failure her hunger revealed will eventually, decades after her death, erupt into a revolution that will remake the political order of Europe. She knows that the ground is soft today. She knows that she has seeds. And she knows that if she does not plant them now, the question of what comes next will answer itself in the worst possible way. So she plants, and that simple, stubborn, forward-looking decision to put something into the ground and trust that it will grow is, I think, the most human thing in this entire story. Not the frozen wine or the shattered church bells or the armies dying on the steppe. Not the empires rising and falling or the refugees floating down the Rhine. All of those are extraordinary. But what is truly extraordinary, in the quiet, undramatic sense of the word, is the ordinary person who looks at a ruined field after the worst winter in 5 centuries and decides to plant anyway. There is one final chapter to this story, the one I have been saving, because we have walked through the winter, the science, the deaths, the empires, the migrations, the recovery. We have traced the threads of 1709 forward through 80 years of French history to a revolution. We have connected a frozen January in the Rhine Valley to the Amish farms of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, but there is one question we've not yet asked directly, the one that, I suspect, is the reason many of you are still here at this hour. listening to a story about a winter that ended 300 years ago. Could this happen again? Not as a curiosity, not as a historical footnote, but actually given what we know about climate, about polar vortices, about the fragility of food systems, about the particular ways that modern civilization is both more resilient and more vulnerable than the France of 1709, could it? That conversation is the one we are about to have. February the 15th, 2021. It is 1 in the morning in Texas, in Houston, in Dallas, in San Antonio, in homes and apartments across the largest state in the continental United States. The lights go out. Not gradually, not with warning. The switches click off one by one as the Texas power grid begins shutting down in rolling blackouts to prevent what engineers were privately calling the unthinkable: total system collapse. And here is the detail that I keep returning to, because it feels almost too precise to be real. According to the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, the body that manages the state's power grid, the Texas grid was 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from a complete failure, a failure that could have left the entire state without electricity not for days, but for weeks, possibly months, because when a grid at that scale collapses entirely, you cannot simply turn it back on like a light switch. You rebuild it from scratch, generator by generator, over a period of time that no modern American city has ever been forced to experience. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That number is sitting in official documents. It is not speculation. It is what the engineers were watching on their screens in the early hours of February the 15th. Now, why am I telling you this story in the middle of a story about 1709? Because Texas in February of 2021 was a small-scale rehearsal for something that the winter of 1709 enacted on the grandest possible stage. And comparing the two, the similarities and the differences, the things that have changed and the things that stubbornly have not is, I think, the most useful lens we have for answering the question we posed at the end of the last chapter. Could 1709 happen again? Let's start with the similarities, because they are more numerous and more uncomfortable than most people want to acknowledge. The Texas freeze of 2021 was triggered by the same basic mechanism as the Great Frost, a disruption of the polar vortex that sent Arctic air flooding southward into regions completely unprepared for it. The same atmospheric physics, the same spinning top knocked off its axis, the same cold air escaping from its usual Arctic home and pouring over a landscape that had built all of its assumptions around historical weather patterns rather than extreme possibilities. In Texas, those historical patterns had said, it gets cold in February, but not like this. Not negative 20 degrees Celsius in places that had never experienced anything below -5. The infrastructure, the power plants, the natural gas pipelines, the electrical grid, the water systems had all been designed around what winter had looked like in the past, not what it could look like in the future, not what it looked like once it arrived in February of 2021. Does that remind you of anything? Does it remind you of a French government in January of 1709 that had no grain reserves, no distribution infrastructure, no contingency plan for a winter of this magnitude? Because such a winter had never happened before. It should, because it is the same failure mode. It just looks different in modern clothes. Let me give you the numbers, because they matter. The Texas freeze of 2021 lasted roughly 10 days. 10 days. Not 90. Temperatures reached -20 in some places, but not the -30 degrees that Swedish soldiers endured in Ukraine. Roughly 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power. At least 246 people died. Some estimates put the true total closer to 700 when accounting for indirect deaths. The economic damage was somewhere between $26 billion and $195 billion, depending on how broadly you account for it. Now compare those numbers to 1709 in France alone. 90 days of freeze, 600,000 dead, an entire generation of vineyards and orchards destroyed, a famine that persisted through 1710. The difference is enormous. And the reason for that difference is not that the cold was less severe, though it was. The reason is everything that has changed between 1709 and 2021: emergency services, food distribution networks, modern heating systems, hospitals, supply chains capable of moving resources across thousands of miles in days rather than weeks. When Texas froze in 2021, the rest of the country did not freeze. Warm food, warm clothing, emergency power, all of it could be routed toward Texas from places that were not affected. The disaster was contained by the very infrastructure that prevented it from cascading. Now imagine that same polar vortex collapse happening across an entire continent simultaneously, all at once, every region affected at the same time, so there is no unaffected region to provide rescue. That is 1709. Here is the question that I find genuinely, quietly disturbing. Could it happen simultaneously across an entire continent again? Or is the modern world simply too well equipped to allow a single weather event to spiral into mass death on that scale? The honest answer, and I want to be honest here, because I think the topic deserves more than reassurance, is it depends on which layer of the question you're asking. At the level of technology and infrastructure, the world of 2025 is vastly more capable than the world of 1709 at surviving a cold event of that severity. We have weather forecasting, we have international food trade networks, we have heating systems powered by electricity rather than firewood, which means we're not entirely dependent on the local forest to stay alive through a cold night. We have emergency medical care that can treat hypothermia. We have the ability to move food and fuel across continents in days. All of that is real and matters enormously. It is why 246 people died in Texas in 2021 rather than 600,000. But, and this is a significant but, the Texas freeze also revealed something that climate scientists have been saying with increasing urgency for the last 2 decades. Modern infrastructure is optimized for historical conditions, not for the extreme events that a destabilizing climate may produce more frequently. Texas had been warned. In 2011, after a similar but milder freeze, federal regulators issued a 357-page report recommending that the state winterize its power infrastructure. The report was ignored because winterizing costs money, and the probability of another event that severe seemed low, and other priorities competed for the budget. 10 years later, the event arrived, and the grid nearly collapsed entirely. This is the core pattern, and it is not unique to Texas. It is visible in infrastructure all over the developed world, which has been built and optimized around the weather of the past century and has, in many places, not yet been updated to account for the weather of the coming one. The climatologist Dennis Wheeler, the same Dennis Wheeler who studied the Great Frost of 1709 for the European Union's Millennium Project, and who said that something unusual seemed to have been happening, was not being coy when he offered that understated assessment. He was pointing at something genuinely important, that the 1709 event exceeds what our current models can fully explain, that there is a residual mystery in the data that no combination of Maunder minimum plus volcanic dust plus polar vortex disruption quite accounts for, and that residual mystery matters, because if we do not fully understand what produced the worst winter in 500 years, we cannot fully calculate the probability of it happening again. The honest position, the scientifically honest position, is that extreme weather events have a long tail of probability that our models tend to underestimate, because our models are calibrated against historical data, and the historical record of truly extreme events is, by definition, sparse. We know that polar vortex disruptions are happenings. We know that the warming Arctic is changing the behavior of the jet stream in ways that can bring unexpected cold to mid-latitude regions. We know that the conditions that produced the 1709 freeze a combination of background cooling factors and an atmospheric event are not beyond possibility in any era, including our own. What we do not know is exactly how often they occur, or when the next one might arrive. let me bring in something that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets in these conversations. The food supply question. Modern global food systems are extraordinarily efficient at moving food from where it is grown to where it is consumed. The global supply chain and intricate web of shipping routes, refrigeration networks, processing facilities, and distribution centers can put Peruvian grapes and Indonesian rice and Australian beef on your grocery store shelf within days of harvest. It is one of the genuine miracles of the modern world. It is also extraordinarily fragile in specific, predictable ways. The global food system operates on what supply chain professionals call just-in-time delivery, meaning that stores carry roughly 3 to 5 days of food inventory at any given time. The food is always in transit somewhere, always moving through the system toward the consumer. There is very little buffer, very little reserve, very little margin for the system to absorb a sustained disruption. In 1709, France's food supply problem was regional. The grain stores that the country had accumulated were simply exhausted by the combination of a poor 1708 harvest and the destruction of the 1709 harvest. The solution, which came too late and was implemented too poorly, was to import grain from elsewhere. Today, if a freeze of 1709 scale were to strike multiple major food-producing regions simultaneously, the import from elsewhere option might not function the way we expect it to, because elsewhere might also be affected, because shipping routes might be disrupted, because the just-in-time system has no buffer to absorb a sustained shock. I am not describing a certainty, I am describing a vulnerability. There is a difference, and the difference matters, because vulnerabilities can be addressed if people are willing to look at them honestly before they are forced to live through them. There is one more dimension to this comparison that I want to bring in, and it is one that I find both genuinely hopeful and genuinely complicated. In 1709, nobody knew the freeze was coming, not a day in advance. Not an hour. The world woke up one morning and it was already there. The knowledge that might have allowed governments to pre-position grain reserves, to warn vulnerable populations to seek shelter, to prepare hospitals for a surge in hypothermia. Cases that knowledge did not exist. In February of 2021, meteorologists in Texas had been watching the polar vortex disruption for days. The models were showing what was coming. The warnings existed, the data was there, and the warnings were largely ignored, not because the technology failed, not because the science was wrong, but because the decision-making process that converts weather forecast into infrastructure preparation failed, because the incentives in the system, economic, political, institutional, made it easier to believe that this winter would probably be fine, that the expensive weatherization was unnecessary. That last time was a fluke and the next time would not be quite that bad. The gap between 1709 and 2021 is, in this sense, not the gap between ignorance and knowledge. It is the gap between no warning and a warning that was not acted upon. And I will leave it to you to decide which is more troubling. A climatology professor at the University of Texas at Austin, speaking in the aftermath of the 2021 freeze, said something that I think deserves to be quoted because it captures the situation precisely. He said, "We cannot rely on our past to guide our future. We must consider a much larger spectrum of possibilities. A much larger spectrum of possibilities." That is not a frightening statement. Or rather, it is only frightening if you hear it as a prediction of catastrophe, rather than as an invitation to prepare more honestly than we have been. The same thing could have been said in 1710, looking at the wreckage of the Great Winter. And in some places, some people did say it, they began keeping weather records more systematically, building grain reserves, thinking differently about the relationship between human communities and the natural forces they had always assumed they could predict. Those efforts, slow and incomplete as they were, eventually produced the weather forecasting and climate science that gives us the ability, today, to see a polar vortex disruption developing before it arrives. The knowledge that was absent in 1709 was built, grain by grain, observation by observation, over 3 centuries of careful attention. The question now is not whether we have the knowledge. We do, in many important ways. The question is whether we will act on it, whether the warnings will be heard, whether the 4 minutes and 37 seconds will be taken seriously the next time, not just in Texas, but everywhere. Let me bring this closer to home, and I mean that quite literally. You are listening to this story tonight from somewhere, a bedroom, maybe a couch, somewhere with a roof and walls and heat. And the reason you have those things, the reason tonight is comfortable rather than dangerous, is not just your individual effort. It is a vast network of infrastructure and supply chains and institutions that are functioning right now in ways that are mostly invisible to you. When the grid fails, you notice the grid. When it does not fail, you forget it exists. This is not a criticism, it is human nature. We adapt to the normal so quickly and so completely that the normal becomes invisible, and we only see the infrastructure when it stops working. What 1709 did, what any catastrophe of sufficient scale does, is make the invisible suddenly, terrifyingly visible: the grain supply, the transportation network, the social fabric that distributes resources, all of it, suddenly, right in front of you, either functioning or not. The people of France in January of 1709 had no idea, when they went to sleep on the evening of January the 5th, that by morning they would be able to see, with perfect terrible clarity, exactly how thin the margin was between the ordinary winter and the catastrophic one. We have the advantage, which they did not have, of being able to see that margin before the crisis arrives. The question is what we choose to do with that advantage. So could it happen again? My honest answer, after spending time with this story across all its dimensions, is this: the specific conditions of 1709, the Maunder minimum, the volcanic accumulation, the particular polar vortex collapse are not exactly replicable. The Little Ice Age is over. The sun is more active. The background conditions are different in important ways. But a sustained cold event, driven by polar vortex disruption, striking a society that has built its infrastructure around historical assumptions rather than extreme possibilities, that scenario is not historical. It is present. It happened in Texas in 2021. It will happen again, somewhere, at some scale, in a form that surprises whoever is there to experience it. The difference between 1709 and the next time is not that the next time cannot happen. It is that we have something the people of 1709 did not have. The story of what happened, the record of what went wrong and why and how long it took to put the pieces back together. That story is a gift. The only question is whether we treat it as one. We are almost at the end of our journey through 1709. Almost. There is one chapter left. The one that brings us back to the very beginning of this story and ties the whole thing together. The one that answers the question I suspect has been quietly underneath everything you've been listening to tonight. Why does any of this matter? Not in the abstract historical sense, but in the specific, personal, right now sense. What do we take from this winter, from these 600,000 dead, from the frozen wine and the shattered church bells and the empire that fell, and the people who survived against all odds and planted seeds in uncertain ground? What do we actually take from all of this and carry forward? That conversation is the last one, and it is the one I have been saving. Here is something that, when I first stumbled across it, genuinely stopped me in the middle of what I was doing. You have almost certainly heard the music of Antonio Vivaldi. Even if you do not know the name, you have heard the music. It has been in movies, in television commercials, in shopping malls, in phone ringtones. It is one of those pieces of music that has somehow become part of the ambient soundtrack of modern life, so familiar that it risks becoming invisible, the way really great things sometimes do when they are everywhere at once. The piece is called The Four Seasons, and the final movement, the one about winter, was composed by a man who was living in Venice during the years immediately following the Great Frost of 1709. A man who, in that extraordinary winter when the Venetian lagoon froze solid and people took to ice skates where gondolas had always floated, was there, in the city, watching it happen. Vivaldi composed the Four Seasons sometime around 1720, publishing it in 1725. Winter, the Fourth Concerto, in F minor, opens with a string of notes that every musician who has studied it describes the same way: cold, sharp, urgent, like something approaching that you cannot quite name yet. The solo violin enters and begins what sounds almost physically like a shiver staccato passages that convey, with uncanny precision, the sensation of cold penetrating through clothing you were sure would be enough. I do not know whether Vivaldi was consciously remembering the winter of 1709 when he wrote it. The piece was composed more than a decade later, and it is accompanied by a sonnet that speaks generally of winter rather than any specific event, but I find it impossible to believe that a man who lived through the Great Frost, in the city of Venice, watching its lagoon freeze for the first time in living memory, impossible to believe that none of that memory found its way into the notes. Art does not work in isolation from experience. It is made of experience, transmuted. What Vivaldi created was a portrait of winter that has outlasted every political arrangement, every empire, every border and kingdom that existed in 1709. The Swedish Empire is gone. The War of the Spanish Succession is a footnote. Louis XIV is a portrait in a museum. But those opening notes of winter, that violin shivering against a backdrop of cold string chords, are still being played tonight. In concert halls and recording studios and YouTube videos and someone's kitchen while they cook dinner. The winter of 1709 left 600,000 dead. It also left, somehow, this, and that is not all it left. Here is the connection that I find almost too elegant to be accidental, though I am sure it is the violins that Vivaldi likely played, and that generations of musicians after him have played, and that are considered the finest stringed instruments ever created. Those violins were made from wood grown during the Little Ice Age, specifically from the slow, cold, dense-grained alpine spruce and maple that grew during the Monde Minimum. The man who made most of these instruments was named Antonio Stradivari. He worked in the Italian city of Cremona, and his golden period, the decades during which he produced what most experts consider his finest work, ran from roughly the year 1700 to 1720, precisely the years of the Monde Minimum's coldest phase, precisely the years that included the winter of 1709. Here is why that matters. During the Monde Minimum, when the sun was quieter and the winters were longer, trees grew more slowly than usual. Slow growth produces wood with a different internal structure, denser, more uniform, with less variation between the spring growth rings and the winter growth rings. And that particular density profile, researchers have found, affects how sound vibrations travel through the wood. The vibrations move more consistently, more evenly. The resonance is different, richer, some say, or simply different in a way that the human ear finds extraordinary. A researcher at the University of Tennessee who studies tree rings, and a climatologist at Columbia University, compared the dates of Stradivari's working life with the climate data for those years, and were astonished to find how precisely they aligned. The wood that became Stradivarius violins, wood that the world's greatest musicians have played for 300 years, wood that produces a sound that no modern instrument has convincingly replicated, that wood grew in the cold of the Little Ice Age, in the cold of the Monde Minimum, indeed, potentially, the exact years that included the winter of 1709. The worst winter in 500 years may have been, among all its other legacies, a contributor to the wood inside the world's most beautiful violins. I sit with that for a moment sometimes. The same cold that killed 600,000 people, that froze wine next to fireplaces, that toppled an empire and drove 30,000 Germans across an ocean that cold, over decades, was also quietly building the acoustic properties of spruce trees in the Italian Alps, that would eventually become instruments capable of producing music so beautiful that people still pay tens of millions of dollars for them. Nature, as it turns out, does not organize itself around human preferences for which consequences it produces. Now, I want to step back from the historical specifics for a moment and ask you something genuinely personal. We have been on a long journey together through this story. From the night of January the 5th to the thaw and the floods, from the frozen wine at Versailles to the Battle of Pultowa, from the Palatine Germans on their boats down the Rhine to the woman in the Loire Valley field in April of 1710 with her handful of seeds, what do you take from all of this? Not in the abstract sense of what are the lessons of history. That phrasing has always felt slightly hollow to me, like something that sounds profound but does not actually land anywhere specific. I mean, what do you, specifically, take from this? What shifts when you understand that the world was once changed this completely, this suddenly, by something that arrived without warning in a single night? Let me offer you a few thoughts of my own, not as conclusions, but as the things I keep returning to after spending a long time inside this story. The first is something about the nature of fragility. The people of France in 1709 were not, by the standards of their era, unusually unprepared or unusually unlucky. They were living in the most powerful kingdom in Europe. They had good years and bad years, as every agricultural society does, and they had managed those variations for centuries. The structures they had built, social, political, economic, had survived many previous winters, many previous famines, many previous wars. They just had not survived this one, and the difference between the winters they had survived and the winter of 1709 was not a difference in kind. It was a difference in degree. It was the same cold, a little colder, the same agricultural vulnerability, a little more exposed, the same inadequate government response, a little more inadequate when the stakes were a little higher. What strikes me about that is how applicable it is to any system, any institution, any life. The things that eventually break us are almost never things we've never seen before. They are things we have seen before, at a level we could manage, arriving at a level we could not. The thing that breaks a relationship is usually something that has been present in smaller form for years. The thing that breaks a business is usually a stress it has handled before, arriving now with the intensity it cannot absorb. The Great Frost of 1709 is, among many other things, one of the most vivid demonstrations in history of how the same system that appears robust under ordinary stress can prove catastrophically fragile under extraordinary stress, and how difficult it is, from the inside, to know which situation you are in until after it is over. The second thing I take from this story is something about how we measure the past. We tend to think of history as a sequence of events, battles won and lost, kings crowned and buried, treaties signed and violated, and those things matter, but running underneath all of those events, shaping them in ways that the participants often could not see, is the physical world, the climate, the weather, the condition of the soil, the health of the harvest. Historians sometimes call this the longue durée, the long duration, a term coined by the French historian Fernand Braudel to describe the slow-moving structural forces that underlie the more dramatic surface of historical events. Climate is perhaps the most fundamental of these forces. It determines what can be grown, which routes can be travelled, how much surplus a society can accumulate, how much stress it can absorb before it breaks. The winter of 1709 is a rare moment when the longue durée becomes visible, when the slow structural force accelerates so dramatically that even the people living through it cannot fail to notice what is happening, when the background becomes the foreground, without warning, in a single night. I find this genuinely useful as a way of thinking about the present. What are the slow structural forces operating right now, underneath the more visible events of daily life, that will eventually surface in ways we are not expecting? What are the longue durée pressures of our own moment, environmental, economic, social, that we are managing when they arrive at manageable levels? But that could arrive at a different level entirely. I am not asking this to produce alarm. I am asking it because I think this is the right question to sit with after spending time with 1709, not Could this happen exactly the same way again? But what are the hairline fractures in the glass right now that nobody's looking at carefully enough? The third thing, and this is the one I want to leave you with tonight, is something about survival, specifically about what it looks like when ordinary people survive extraordinary things. We have talked about armies and kings and diplomats and political consequences, but the real story of 1709, the one that lives in the parish registers and the household accounts and the local history projects that scholars have assembled over decades, is the story of millions of people who woke up one morning in January and discovered that everything was different and then kept going anyway. They buried their dead in the frozen ground, or stored them in barns until the ground could be broken. They burned their furniture to stay warm, and then their doors. They ate fern soup and bark and things that were not meant to be food. Some of them did not survive, but the ones who did, and the majority did, which is itself a remarkable fact given the scale of the disaster. The ones who did emerged into a spring that was flooded, and a summer that was hungry, and an autumn that was still not back to normal, and they planted, and they tended, and they made what they could make. There is no heroism in this that announces itself, no dramatic decision point where a single person's courage changed everything. It is the aggregate of millions of small decisions to keep going, made over months and years, by people whose names are mostly lost to history. The woman in the field with her seeds, the parish priest who organized the distribution of whatever the community had, the neighbour who shared the last of the stored grain because the family next door had none. What the Great Frost of 1709 required, what it ultimately revealed, is not grand heroism. It is the everyday kind, the kind that does not look heroic because it does not feel like a choice. You wake up. The world is still broken. You do what can be done today. You come back and do it again the next day. This goes on for months. Eventually, something begins to grow. That is not inspiration in the usual sense, but it might be the truest kind. And then there is the Stradivarius violin playing Vivaldi's Winter. 300 years later, in a concert hall somewhere in the world tonight, the wood grown in the cold, the music written by a man who survived the same cold, the fingers of a musician whose name Vivaldi never knew, pressing strings made from the era of the Great Frost, drawing from them sounds that could not have been produced by any other cold, any other soil, any other specific confluence of temperature and time. The winter of 1709 is, among all the things it was, also this, a reminder that the forces that break things and the forces that create things are sometimes the same forces, the same slow, cold decades that killed the olive trees and froze the wine also grew the wood for the finest violins ever made. The same catastrophe that drove 30,000 Germans to an uncertain new world also planted the roots of German-American communities that shaped an entire continent. The same disaster that exposed the fatal flaws of the Ancien Regime also set in motion the political and intellectual currents that would eventually, decades later, produce a revolution in the name of liberty. None of this is consolation for the 600,000 dead. I want to be clear about that. The dead are not redeemed by the music or the migrations or the political consequences. The loss is real, and it was enormous, and it should be grieved as such. But alongside the grief, there is something else that the story of 1709 carries, a kind of stubborn evidence that catastrophe does not have the final word, that the thing that arrives in the night and changes everything does not, in the end, determine everything, that something always continues, something always plants its seeds in the uncertain ground, and that something quiet, unheroic, patient, necessary is perhaps the most important thing in the world. We are almost at the end, one more chapter, and in that final chapter, I want to bring everything together, the wine and the violins and the frozen Baltic and the Pennsylvania Dutch farmhouses, and the 4 minutes and 37 seconds in Texas, and leave you with something that I hope you will carry forward from tonight. Because I think there is a question at the very heart of this story that we have been circling without asking directly, and it is time to ask it. Let me tell you about a particular detail that scholars discovered only relatively recently, something that, to me, captures the entire spirit of this story better than anything else I have come across. In the months following the Great Frost of 1709, as the dead were still being counted and the floods were still receding, and the spring planting was still failing, something unusual happened in the academic world of Europe. At the University of Halle in Germany, a student defended a dissertation on June the 13th, 1709, just 5 months after the freeze began, with a title that translates roughly as a physico-mathematical consideration of the most recent winter. 5 months. The disaster was still unfolding. People were still dying from the secondary effects. The political consequences were still being sorted, and already someone was sitting down with instruments and mathematical reasoning and trying to understand what had happened, trying to turn catastrophe into knowledge. This was, historians now recognize, the first major winter in European history to coincide with all three of the preconditions for systematic scientific inquiry: the existence of scientific societies capable of gathering and sharing observations, enough thermometers and barometers distributed across Europe to produce actual data, and the print culture to disseminate that data widely enough to build collective understanding. The winter of 1709 was, in other words, the first great natural disaster that humanity tried to study while it was still happening. What William Derham was doing in Upminster, checking his thermometer 3 times a day, recording the numbers, sending his findings to the Royal Society in London, that was not an isolated act of curiosity. It was part of something larger, something new, an emerging practice of watching the natural world with instruments rather than just with eyes, of accumulating data rather than just impressions, of asking systematic questions rather than accepting mystery, and the answer to those questions partial, incomplete, still contested 3 centuries later, became the foundation on which all subsequent climate science was built. The worst winter in 500 years was also the beginning of the world's attempt to understand winter itself. That detail has stayed with me throughout this entire story. Not because it redeems the suffering, it does not, and nothing does, but because it tells you something profound about the human impulse at the heart of this whole enterprise of understanding the past. When something terrible happens, the first response is to survive it, then to grieve it, then, eventually, and this is the distinctly human thing to understand it, to ask why, to try to build from the wreckage a framework that makes the next terrible thing a little less terrible, a little more anticipated, a little more survivable. That is what William Derham was doing with his thermometer. It is what those scholars at Halle were doing with their dissertation. It is what the parish priests were doing when they recorded, carefully and completely, the deaths in their registers, making sure that even if the individual people were forgotten, the fact that they had existed and the fact that they had died in this particular catastrophic season would be remembered by someone, somewhere, in a form that future generations could access. It is what we are doing right now, sitting with this story 316 years later, trying to understand, trying to learn, trying to carry something forward from the frozen January of 1709 into the uncertain winters of whatever comes next. So let me ask the question that I promised at the end of the last chapter, the one that sits at the centre of everything. What do we actually take from this? What is the thing, the one thing, or the few things that this story asks of us? I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I keep arriving at 3 answers. Not lessons in the didactic sense, not rules or prescriptions, just 3 observations that feel true to me, and that seem to follow honestly from what 1709 was. The first is this: the margin matters more than the headline. In 1709, France was, by the headlines, the most powerful kingdom in Europe, the most magnificent palace, the largest army, the greatest cultural prestige. All of that was real, but none of it was the thing that mattered when the winter arrived. What mattered was the margin, the grain reserves, the distribution infrastructure, the capacity of the rural poor to absorb a shock, The government's ability to respond quickly when the quick response was the only response that could save lives. The margin was thin, and the headline obscured the margin, right up until the moment the margin failed. This is a pattern that repeats in every era, in every domain. The company that appears invincible until it runs out of cash. The relationship that looks strong until a crisis reveals how thin the actual trust had become. The infrastructure that holds up under normal conditions until it meets the condition it was never designed for. The winter of 1709 did not care about the grandeur of Versailles. It cared about the state of the grain stores. And the question worth asking, regularly and honestly, is not, what do we look like from the outside? But, what does the margin look like? The second observation is about the value of the warning. 1709 happened without a warning, not because the physics made warning impossible, but because the instruments and institutions capable of producing and distributing a warning did not yet exist. The knowledge that a polar vortex disruption of catastrophic scale was building in the stratosphere, that it would arrive on the evening of January the 5th, that knowledge was unavailable to anyone on Earth. At any price, it simply did not exist. Today, that knowledge exists. We can watch the polar vortex in real time from satellites. We can model the behavior of atmospheric systems with an accuracy that would have seemed magical to anyone alive in 1709. The warning is there. The lesson that Texas in 2021 adds to the lesson of France in 1709 is not about the warning itself. It is about the gap between warning and action. The warning about winterizing the Texas power grid existed for a decade before the grid failed. It existed in a 357-page federal report that sat, unimplemented, because the cost of preparation felt larger than the probability of catastrophe right up until the probability stopped being theoretical. The question the winter of 1709 asks us, in this respect, is not, do we have the warning? We often do. The question is, are we treating the warning as if it means what it says? The third observation is the simplest and the one I return to most often. The people who survived 1709 were not the strongest. They were not the cleverest. They were not the best prepared, in any individual sense. They were the people who, in the most fundamental and unremarkable way, kept going, who planted when the ground was uncertain, who shared when sharing was costly, who buried their dead and then came back the next morning and started again. There is no philosophy in this, no grand theory, just the daily, ordinary, unremarkable practice of continuing, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one handful of seeds at a time. I find something genuinely comforting in that, not because hard times are not hard, they are, and 1709 was as hard as it gets, but because it means that what is required of most of us, most of the time, is not heroism in the dramatic sense. It is the smaller, quieter, more durable version, showing up, doing what can be done, coming back and doing it again. The survivors of 1709 were ordinary people who survived an extraordinary thing by continuing to be ordinary, day after day, until the spring came, and the spring, eventually, always comes, that wine, frozen in the bottle next to the fireplace in Versailles. I've been thinking about that image for months. It is such a specific, strange, perfect image. Wine, which is itself the product of warmth, of sun falling on grapes over the course of a summer frozen solid, in the middle of a room designed for warmth, by a fire meant to prevent exactly this. The ordinary protection failing against the extraordinary force, the room still beautiful, the fire still burning, and the wine solid. But here is the other side of that image, the one that I want to leave you with tonight. In the spring of 1710, someone in the wine regions of France in Beaune, in Burgundy, in the Loire Valley planted a new vine. It was a small, fragile thing. The old vines, the ones that had been growing for a century, were dead. The roots had frozen and burst. The wood was black. The landscape that had produced wine for generations was a wasteland. But wine grapes have this quality: they can be regrown from cuttings. a piece of living wood, taken from a surviving vine, planted in new ground, will grow. It is slow. A new vine takes years to produce fruit, and several years more to produce wine of any quality. It is uncertain. The soil may not be exactly right, the positioning not quite what it was. It is nothing like as grand as the old vineyards that stood for a century, but it is alive, and it is a beginning. The wine of France did not disappear after 1709. It came back, not immediately, not easily, not without years of patient, unglamorous labour in uncertain ground, but it came back, and the wine regions of France today, Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Loire, Champagne, those are, in part, the descendants of vines planted by people who just survived the worst winter in 500 years and decided to plant anyway. That is what I want you to carry from this story, not the ice, not the cold, not even the 600,000 dead, as important as it is to hold them in memory. What I want you to carry is the person who planted the vine in the uncertain spring, who had every reason not to every reason to believe the ground was still poisoned, the effort futile, the loss too great to ever be recovered, who planted anyway, because that is what people who intend to survive do. They plant in uncertain ground. They come back the next day. They wait for the spring that, eventually, always comes. We have travelled a long way together tonight, across oceans and centuries, through frozen seas and burning fields, through royal courts and village cemeteries and battlefields and refugee camps and the quiet fields of spring. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. Genuinely, this is the kind of story that takes time to tell properly, and you gave me that time, and I am grateful for it. The winter of 1709 was the worst thing that happened to Europe in 500 years of winters. It was also the thing that built the first systematic weather observations, the thing that sent the ancestors of millions of Americans across an ocean, the thing that helped create the violins of Stradivarius and the music of Vivaldi, the thing that set in motion slowly, imperfectly, over decades, the political changes that would eventually reshape the world. It was all of those things simultaneously. That is what history is, not one thing at a time, but everything at once, all of it connected, all of it alive in ways we cannot always see from inside it. The record has held for 316 years. January the 5th, 1709, remains the coldest night in Europe in half a millennium. The wine that froze in that bottle is long gone, but the story of it is still here, still being told, still finding new ears in new ages that have their own frozen bottles and their own uncertain springs. This is why we tell stories about the past, not to escape the present, but to understand it more honestly, to see the shape of the thing we are inside. And now pull your blanket a little closer, let the room settle, let whatever is worrying you tonight rest for a moment, the way a frozen field rests before the planting. The spring, as always, is coming. I will see you in the next story.